I was a park ranger for a long time, long enough to see the patterns people fall into when they come out into the woods. It doesn't matter what park or what season, you always get the same types. The quiet families who just want peace and space, the hikers who stay to themselves, the couples who think a tent is soundproof, and the groups like the one I dealt with that night. Frat boys, young and full of themselves, acting like the forest was their backyard party spot. It was late summer, that stretch of the year when the air gets cooler at night, but still smells like pine sap and dust. I was stationed at a site near the edge of a long canyon that opened up into a network of dry washes and scrub-covered slopes. Perfect mountain lion territory. We got the first noise complaint around 10:30. The campers at the next site over said they'd been yelling, laughing, blasting music, and throwing bottles into the fire. I remember standing outside the patrol cabin, listening, and I could actually hear the echoes from almost a quarter-mile away. It wasn't hard to find them. You could follow the noise. Their campsite was a mess of tents, beer cans, and smoke. I gave them the standard warning. Quiet hours start at 10. Sound carries far at night, and the wildlife out here isn't scared of people the way it used to be. They nodded, said they understood, and I left it at that. An hour later, they were even louder. I could hear them again all the way from the ranger station. So we drove back out, me and Jim, another ranger who'd been on the job about as long as I had. He was the kind of guy who took things personally when campers didn't listen. We got there just after midnight, and I remember thinking the campfire light made their faces look too bright, like they were glowing against the black trees. I told them this was their last warning. I explained that being that loud wasn't just rude, it was dangerous. The local mountain lions, what a few of us called ghost cats, had learned to come close when they heard strange noises. They were curious, especially the big males. I told the group to stay in their tents the rest of the night, and if they heard or saw anything, not to move, not to make a sound. Then we left. On the drive back, Jim got that look he always got when an idea was forming. He said something about giving them a scare, just enough to make them remember the rules. We'd pulled stunts like that before. Nothing harmful, just lessons people remembered better than lectures. It was always about respect for the place, the animals, the fact that the woods weren't there for anyone's entertainment. So we came up with the plan as we drove. We went by the Interpretation Center, a small educational building we used for school programs and wildlife demos. Hanging in one corner was a tanned mountain lion pelt, stretched and cleaned, its glassy eyes dull but eerie in the half-light. Jim grabbed the night vision goggles and I took the big mag light. We loaded everything into the back of the Jeep and drove back toward the campsite, headlights off for the last half-mile. It was close to 2 a.m. when we arrived. Their fire was dying down and the noise had stopped completely. The only sound was the wind sliding through the trees. We parked a short distance away and walked in, careful to stay quiet. With the pelt and a set of old hiking poles, I rigged up a kind of silhouette. From the right angle, in the dark, it looked like a mountain lion crouched low to the ground. Jim went around with a metal paw mold we'd used for tracking demos, pressing deep prints into the soft dirt. They were huge, spaced just right to make it seem like something big had been pacing through the area. Once we had everything set, Jim took the handheld PA we used for search operations and started broadcasting the faint sounds of lion calls, those low, almost human-sounding moans they make when they're close. He started from far off, then moved closer in small steps. I got in the Jeep, flicked on the high beams, and swept the light slowly over the campsite. The beam caught the pelt silhouette, and because I was still moving the light, the shadow looked alive. It stretched and rippled across the tents just for a second, and even I felt the chill of it. Then Jim shouted through the PA that the lions were moving in. I played along, moving the light fast, cutting it out, then back on. The campers started losing it. You could hear the nylon of their tents rustling, someone whispering sharply, another zipper half open then yanked shut. Jim shouted again that we had to go, that there were 2 of them now, and that's when we both jumped in the Jeep, killed the lights completely, and tore off down the road laughing like idiots. By the time we made it back to the station, the adrenaline had worn off. We left the pelt and gear where they were and called it a night. I remember thinking it would make for a funny story at the next staff meeting. But when we went back the next morning, things didn't look funny anymore. The frat boys' campsite was empty, but not like someone packing up early. Their coolers were tipped over, gear scattered, trash spread out across the site. At first I thought raccoons or coyotes had gotten into it. Then I saw the paw prints. Ours had been pressed shallow into the dirt, fake and obvious up close. But mixed in with them were others, real ones. They cut across our tracks, fresh and deep, with drag marks from a heavy tail. They circled the fire pit twice and led off into the brush behind the tents. There were drops of something dark on one of the tent flaps. Not much, just a few small spots. Could have been sap, could have been something else. I didn't see any blood trails or signs of a struggle, and there were no bodies, no torn tents. But what I did notice was how the prints stopped about 40 yards from camp. Just stopped. No return path, no scatter of dirt, nothing. It looked like whatever made them came in from the hills, moved around the camp, then disappeared. Around 8:30, we finally saw them coming down the trail, all of them together, pale and quiet. They'd hiked out at dawn and gone straight to the visitor parking lot to sleep in their cars. When we asked if they were okay, they said they were done camping for good. None of them wanted to talk about what they'd heard or seen. They just packed up and left. Jim laughed about it later, said we'd done our job a little too well. But I kept thinking about those tracks. They were deeper than the fake ones, spaced wider apart. I'd tracked lions before, and I knew what a full-grown male could do when it got close. I went back a few more times over the next week, followed the dry creek beds and ridge lines, but never found where those tracks led. I left the job a few years later, but I still think about that night sometimes. We meant it as a joke, something harmless to teach a bunch of loud kids a lesson, but every time I picture that camp in the dark, the wind moving through the trees, the shadow of the pelt swaying in the beam of my flashlight, I wonder if we were the only ones there. I had been planning a solo camping trip along the Mogollon Rim in Arizona for weeks. I had my backpack, a small tent, a portable stove, and my dog, a medium-sized shepherd mix who had always been my loyal companion on trips like these. The rim is beautiful, but it's isolated and rugged, with cliffs dropping off sharply and dense forest covering much of the area. I chose a spot a little off the main trail where the trees opened up into a small clearing. I set up my campfire near the center, laid out my sleeping pad and tent, and spent the late afternoon exploring the surrounding trees and the edge of the cliffs. By the time the sun started dipping below the horizon, the forest had gone quiet, the birds and small animals retreating to their nighttime routines, leaving a heavy stillness in the air that only the desert night can hold. As darkness fully settled in, I sat near the fire, my dog lying at my feet. The flames cast flickering shadows across the clearing, making the surrounding trees seem alive. My dog's ears perked occasionally at the sound of branches shifting, small animals rustling in the underbrush, and the occasional gust of wind carrying the dry scent of pine and sage. I was enjoying the calm, the crackle of the fire, and the endless stars overhead when I heard a faint rustling from a nearby bush. It was subtle but enough to make me glance over. I thought it might be a deer or some other small animal, but then I noticed my dog stiffen. Usually he would bark, alert, ready to chase anything that moved near the camp, but instead he whined softly and pressed himself closer to me, his eyes fixed on the bush. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. Maybe it was just my imagination, I told myself, maybe a rabbit or a fox. I poked at the fire, adding another log to keep it burning bright, hoping the light would be enough to discourage any wildlife. The rustling stopped, and I felt a bit relieved. A few minutes passed, and then I heard it again, this time coming from a different bush near the edge of the clearing. The noise was sharper, heavier, like something larger moving through the brush. My dog jumped up and ran to the tent, scratching at the door, his low whine growing into a nervous bark. That was unusual. He never ran to the tent like that unless he felt truly threatened. My stomach sank. Whatever was out there, it was bigger than a deer. I picked up a couple of rocks and threw them in the direction of the noise, trying to make a clatter to scare it away. The rustling stopped for a moment, then resumed, slower this time, deliberate. My dog stayed pressed against the tent, panting but clearly tense, and I realized there was nothing I could do but stay put. I tossed a few pieces of wood onto the fire, the flames flaring up and throwing dancing shadows across the clearing. I climbed into the tent, pulling my dog inside with me, feeling the thin fabric of the tent suddenly inadequate against whatever was circling us. Outside, I could hear the faint scratching of branches and the occasional rustle, and every snap of a twig made my heart leap. I kept the fire burning as long as I could see the orange glow flickering through the tent walls, hoping it would make whatever was out there keep its distance. Sleep was uneasy. My dog stayed alert, growling softly whenever he heard a sound outside, and I lay awake, listening to the dark forest around us. Each time a branch snapped or the wind shifted, I imagined huge eyes reflecting the firelight, close enough to see but hidden just out of sight. It wasn't until the first light of dawn crept across the sky that the noises finally stopped. I unzipped the tent slowly, peeking outside. The clearing was empty, peaceful in the morning light, the fire reduced to glowing embers. My dog immediately ran out, sniffing around, and I followed him, still on edge, looking for signs of what had been out there. Behind the bushes where the noises had come from, I found the tracks. They were large, round, and deep in the soft soil, circling our camp in a cautious, deliberate pattern. My stomach sank when I realized exactly what I was looking at. Mountain lion tracks, big enough to belong to a mature adult, the kind of predator that could easily reach the fire's edge without making a sound. My dog had sensed it all along. His behavior hadn't been fear of some random small animal. That alone explained the circling, the hesitation, the quiet presence in the night. If I had gone to investigate at night, if I had stepped outside to see what was making the noise, it could have ended very badly. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear, knowing that the predator had been close enough to potentially attack but had chosen not to. Maybe it had been sizing us up, deciding we weren't worth the risk. Or maybe the fire and my dog had been enough to keep it away. Either way, the memory of the whimpers and the scratching stayed with me, a reminder that nature, especially out in the wilds of Arizona, is not to be underestimated. I spent the rest of the morning carefully packing up, keeping an eye on the surrounding woods. The tracks continued for a while beyond our campsite, showing the mountain lion moving through the trees and across the open patches, eventually disappearing into the dense forest. I made a mental note to stick to well-established trails and campgrounds in the future, and to respect the territory of animals that could kill with ease. My dog never left my side the rest of the trip, and I stayed vigilant, knowing that even in daylight, the rim was still wild and unpredictable. The experience left me cautious but also grateful. We had both survived the night unharmed. A brush with one of the forest's most formidable predators that could have ended very differently if I had been less careful or less aware of my dog's instincts. It was a lesson in humility, a reminder that out there, even a small mistake could have serious consequences, and that sometimes survival depends on paying attention to the subtle warnings nature provides. I was camping on the west coast, a little ways north of Mendocino, where the woods press close to the ocean and the mornings stay cool and damp, even in summer. I wasn't deep in the backcountry, just at one of those small campgrounds tucked among the redwoods, the kind that's quiet at night except for the sound of wind moving through the trees. I'd been there a few days already, mostly keeping to myself, hiking short trails and sitting by the fire until late. I've got back problems, so I don't do tents anymore. I'd converted the back seat of my car into a kind of sleeping bench with a foam mattress topper and a sleeping bag laid over it. I always cover the windows with dark panels I cut from old camping mats, so nobody can see in. It's surprisingly comfortable, and I can still wake up to the smell of pine and salt in the air. That night, everything was calm. I remember hearing the faint hum of the ocean beyond the trees and the occasional creak from the branches above me. The air was cold enough that I tucked myself deep into the sleeping bag. The campground had maybe 4 other groups spread out far apart, and the nearest one was at least 100 feet away. Around midnight, I woke up once because of my back, adjusted the sleeping bag, and went right back to sleep. I don't know exactly what time it was when the noise started, but it was early, maybe around dawn. The light hadn't started to come through the covers yet. I was in that half-awake state where, you're not dreaming, but you're not ready to move either. That's when I heard it, this low, rolling rumble that came from somewhere outside the car. It wasn't the growl of an engine or the call of an animal. It was steady, like something heavy being dragged or rolled across gravel. The best way I can describe it is like the sound of a shopping cart with one bad wheel being pushed across a rough parking lot, where the uneven bits of concrete catch the metal and make that loud clattering grind. At first, I thought maybe it was another camper packing up early, maybe moving some kind of gear or dragging a trailer hitch. But the sound didn't fade or move away. It came closer. It got louder, slow, and deliberate, like whatever was making it was moving right alongside my car. I could hear the crunch of dry pine needles underfoot, mixed with that low grinding noise. I held my breath and listened. My brain started running through all the logical explanations. Maybe a bear was nosing around the campsites. Maybe a deer had brushed against something metal. Maybe it was just the wind rattling something loose. But then the car shifted. It wasn't just a small bump. The whole car jolted, hard enough that I felt my body move with it. It was like someone had leaned their full weight against the side and given it one strong shove. My heart jumped straight into my throat. I didn't move for a few seconds, frozen in that dark space, trying to listen for any more sounds. All I could hear was my pulse thudding in my ears. When I finally started to move, it was slow, awkward. I tried to unzip the sleeping bag from the inside, but I'd zipped it too high earlier in the night, and the zipper got caught in the fabric. My hands were shaking a little, and it felt like forever before I managed to get it open enough to sit up. The car was completely dark inside, the covers still sealed tight on the windows. I pushed one corner down and looked out through the small gap. There was nothing. The morning was just starting to lighten. The forest had that bluish tint it gets before sunrise, where you can't tell what's shadow and what's solid. I waited, listening again. The rumbling was gone. No footsteps, no scraping, no sound at all except for the faint whisper of wind through the trees. My car was parked on a patch of compact dirt, not gravel, so I couldn't see any clear prints through the window. After a few minutes, I got the courage to step outside. The air was damp and cold enough that it hit my face like mist. I checked around the car carefully, walking in slow circles. There were a few marks in the dirt, but they didn't look like boot prints or paw prints. Just odd, shallow impressions, like something heavy had pressed into the ground and then dragged. They weren't deep enough to be from a bear, and they weren't the kind of tracks a raccoon or deer would leave. The side of the car where it had been hit had a faint smear on it, almost like dust mixed with moisture. It wasn't a scratch or dent, just a wide smudge about 2 feet off the ground. I rubbed it with my thumb, and it came off easily, like dried mud. I couldn't tell what it was. The direction it went in pointed straight toward the tree line, where the ground sloped down toward a creek. The strangest part was that I never found any more clear signs. I walked to the edge of the trees and tried to look for broken branches or something disturbed in the undergrowth. Nothing. The forest floor there was thick with pine needles, and even if something big had passed through, the ground had already settled back into place. I stood there for a while just listening, trying to catch even the smallest sound of movement. But it was completely still. Later that morning, when the other campers started waking up, I walked the loop road to see if anyone else had heard something. A couple of people were making breakfast, and one guy had a dog with him, but nobody mentioned any noise or movement during the night. The dog seemed perfectly calm, which didn't help me make sense of it. If there'd been a bear or some kind of large animal, you'd think a dog would have barked. I went into town later that day and stopped at a ranger station just to ask what animals might make a sound like that. Low and metallic, almost like dragging metal or stone. The ranger listed the usual suspects, bears, raccoons, elk, but nothing really fit. He said sometimes deer kick at cars if they see their reflection in the windows. I thought about that, but whatever hit the car was strong enough to rock it, not just tap it. I stayed one more night, though I didn't sleep much. Every time the wind pushed against the trees or something shifted in the distance, I'd wake up and hold my breath. But nothing happened. It was quiet all night. When I got home a few days later, I washed the car and looked again for marks or dents. There was nothing left. No real evidence that anything unusual had happened at all. The only proof I had was how vivid it still felt. The sound that woke me up. The way the ground seemed to vibrate right before the car moved. And that sick jolt in my stomach when I realized something had been close enough and strong enough to push a vehicle my size. I've thought about that morning for years now. I've gone over every possibility I can come up with. An earthquake tremor, a falling tree limb, a human messing around. But none of them fit perfectly. The ground wasn't shaking, there were no fallen branches, and no footprints big enough to make sense. Maybe it really was an animal I just never saw, something that passed through quick and quiet. But whatever it was big enough to make me feel small inside that car. And sometimes, when I wake up early before dawn, and everything's still and gray outside, I swear I can still hear that same low rumble, distant but steady, like something heavy rolling across the edge of the earth, just waiting to pass by again. Back in 2010, I had just finished a wilderness leadership course and felt like I needed to test myself. I didn't want to be around people. Didn't want the usual trails or campsites. I wanted silence, isolation, the kind where you start hearing your own heartbeat echo in your ears. So I picked Colorado. I'd read about these hot springs along the Colorado River that were only reachable in winter. When the snow melted, the river swelled and swallowed them up. But in the cold months, you could hike in and soak beneath the stars. It sounded perfect. The land was managed by the BLM, and the woman who worked that section told me to write the date on my windshield every week so she'd know I hadn't died out there. I remember laughing when she said that, but later I realized she wasn't really joking. I parked my old Subaru at the edge of a dirt access road, packed my gear, and started the 4-mile hike down to where I'd camp. The trail wasn't really a trail, more like faint paths used by animals and the occasional backcountry hiker. Everything around me was silent in that heavy way that snow and cold bring. The air had that sharp metallic edge that bites the inside of your nose when you breathe too deep. Every step crunched over thin layers of ice or hard-packed snow. It felt good, though. Clean, empty, untouched. By the time I reached the cliffs above the river, the sun was dropping behind the canyon walls, turning everything into long blue shadows. I picked a flat spot near the edge where I could see down to the water. The drop was about 40 feet, and at the bottom, the river curved slow and dark, with steam rising from a section where the hot springs bubbled up near the bank. I figured if something went wrong, if a bear came sniffing around or if I needed to bail fast, I could jump the cliff, hit the water, and make it to the hot springs before freezing. It was a crazy plan, but out there, crazy plans start to make sense. You start thinking differently when you're surrounded by miles of nothing but wind and snow. I set up camp carefully. My tent was small and low to the ground. I dug out a little windbreak and made sure my food was in a bear canister set far away from where I slept. I had bear spray, but I remember sitting there that first night realizing how useless it would be if something decided to tear through the tent in the dark. You can't aim or react fast enough when you're zipped inside nylon. I sat for a while, staring at the last light fading from the canyon rim, listening to the occasional crack of ice breaking on the river. Everything out there seemed alive in its own slow way. The days passed quietly. I'd hike along the canyon edges, explore patches of forest, melt snow for water, soak in the hot springs when the air got too cold to bear. The heat from the water felt surreal, like standing in a pocket of summer in the middle of winter. I'd lean back against the rocks and stare up at the sky, and sometimes I'd catch sight of bald eagles drifting along the river. At night, I'd crawl into my sleeping bag early, listen to the wind scrape against the tent, and drift off to the sound of the river below. Everything felt peaceful, though that peace had an edge to it. It's hard to describe, like you're being tolerated by the wilderness, but never welcomed. By the end of the first week, the stillness started to feel heavy. It wasn't the kind of silence you get used to. It was deeper, pressing against you. I kept thinking about bears. It was winter, so they should have been asleep, but the idea stuck in my head anyway. What if one didn't sleep? What if one was hungry? Every noise outside my tent at night started to sound bigger than it was. Every gust of wind became footsteps. I'd wake up at random hours, heart pounding, convinced something was moving around out there. I'd sit up and listen for minutes on end until I could convince myself it was nothing. Then I'd fall asleep again, only for the same fear to crawl back up later. One morning, early, maybe around 4 or 5, I woke to this deep, heavy sound outside the tent. It wasn't the wind, it was slower, rhythmic, like footsteps crunching through frozen dirt. I froze, eyes open in the dark, my body tense and still under the sleeping bag. The noise came closer. There was breathing, too. Not human breathing. It had this wet, thick sound to it, followed by a grunt, then another. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. I remember gripping the bear spray, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even unzip the tent. The idea of making noise, of letting whatever was out there know I was awake, made me feel sick. The steps got closer. I heard the snow crushing under its weight, slow and deliberate. Then the breathing was right next to the tent wall. I could feel it, something large, exhaling through its nose, sniffing. It brushed against the side of the tent lightly, and I swear I could hear the fabric shift from its breath. I didn't move a muscle. I just lay there trying to breathe as quietly as possible. Time slowed down. It felt like I stayed frozen for hours, though it was probably just minutes. Eventually, the noise started to fade. The breathing moved away, and then I heard more sounds. Different pitches, different paces, more footsteps. There wasn't just one of them. There were several. I could hear them snorting, the clicking of hooves against the icy ground, low grunts. I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the tent just a little. Cold air rushed in and I peeked out. The sky was still dark, but the horizon was turning pale gray. And right there, not 20 feet from my tent, was a herd of elk. Massive, quiet figures moving through the snow like shadows. There must have been a dozen of them, maybe more. Their breath came out in big white clouds. I watched them for a long time, not even daring to move fully. The bull stood at the edge of the group, his head low, antlers catching the first bit of light. He looked unreal against the frozen landscape, like something carved out of the cold itself. Relief washed through me so hard I felt dizzy. My hands were shaking. I stayed still until they all moved on, their shapes fading between the trees and snowdrifts, leaving only their tracks behind. When the last of them disappeared, I let out a long breath and realized how close I'd been to losing it. My sleeping bag was damp with sweat even though the air was freezing. I remember unzipping the tent completely and just sitting there in the cold morning air, staring at the footprints, trying to calm down. The fear I'd felt, it wasn't something that went away easily. It had been so real, so absolute. In those moments before I knew what they were, I was sure I was seconds from being mauled to death. The rest of the trip went on fine, but something had shifted. I wasn't as comfortable out there anymore. Every creak or sound brought back that same dread. Even knowing it had just been elk didn't help much. I think once you really feel that kind of fear, the kind where you're certain you're about to die, it sticks with you. It rewires you a little. I lasted another week before heading back to the car. When I got there, I scraped the date onto the windshield like the BLM lady had told me, then sat inside for a long time with the heater blasting, just staring at the road ahead. It's strange. Looking back, that trip was peaceful and beautiful, but when I think about it now, what I remember most isn't the quiet or the stars or the hot springs. It's that sound outside my tent in the dark, the slow crunch of footsteps, the heavy breathing, the cold weight of waiting for something to happen. Out there, the line between safety and danger is razor thin. Sometimes it's just a herd of elk, but until you know that for sure, it feels like the whole wilderness is holding its breath, waiting for you to make one wrong move. I used to be a leader for a youth group that was similar to Scouts, and for years we spent countless weekends in the woods. Most of the time, the weird stuff we encountered had simple explanations: animals, odd echoes, branches snapping. But there was one night during a camping trip that still haunts me whenever I think about it. I remember it vividly because it was a mix of fear, adrenaline, and the uncanny sense that something was just wrong in a way I couldn't rationalize. That summer, our group had chosen a new, massive stretch of terrain that none of us had explored before. Normally, we would spend time scouting a location in advance, noting hazards, tricky terrain, or areas that weren't suitable for children. That year, it was impossible to check everything because the area was enormous and densely wooded, with open clearings interspersed with deep clusters of trees. We decided it was safe enough for the children, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that the woods were too vast to fully control or anticipate. As always, one of our highlights was the night game. We would set up a series of checkpoints across the campsite and the surrounding forest. The children, ages 8 to 10, would navigate from one checkpoint to the next, completing small challenges, while leaders like me would try to scare them in creative, harmless ways. This night was meant to be the most exciting one of the camp. I had chosen an open stretch of forest with very little undergrowth, the perfect place to sprint after kids without them seeing me in advance. The only hiding places were scattered trees, and because of the open area, I didn't want to use my flashlight, which would have revealed my location instantly. The forest was suffocatingly dark, the kind of darkness where your eyes play tricks on you, where shadows stretch and morph, and your imagination starts filling in gaps. I was moving from checkpoint to checkpoint when I caught a shadow moving past me. At first, I brushed it off as a trick of the eyes. In my line of work, you get used to seeing glimpses of movement in the corner of your eye, usually just branches swaying or the wind rustling leaves. But the shadow appeared again, and it was roughly the same size as me. I turned my flashlight to check, but nothing was there. I assumed it was exhaustion or nerves playing with me. As the game neared its end, I saw the shadow again. This time it was standing near a tree a short distance away. I assumed it was another leader hiding to scare the kids and approached. As I got closer, I could make out the figure more clearly. It was wearing a torn burlap sack, and its head was obscured by several white plastic bags tied together. My stomach dropped. Something about the figure felt wrong. It didn't move naturally, didn't respond to my calls. All I heard was a dull, rhythmic sound, like someone knocking on wood. The sound grew louder as I cautiously moved closer, keeping my distance. That's when I realized it wasn't knocking. It was smacking its head against the tree repeatedly. The figure was barefoot, with crusted mud on its arms and legs, and its hands were contorted in a strange, unnatural way. It was unmistakably human, likely male. My mind raced. Could this be some insane prank by one of the other leaders? I told it to knock it off, trying to keep my voice steady, but the figure began to turn its head slowly toward me. My gut screamed at me to run. No rational explanation could override the intense sense of danger I felt. I bolted through the trees, ignoring the sound of someone, or something, running behind me. My lungs burned. My legs pumped as fast as they could carry me through the dark forest, branches slapping my arms and face. I dared not turn my head. I had to get back to the campsite. When I finally burst into the clearing where our tents were set up, every person who could have been dressed like that was already accounted for. There was no one missing, no one hiding. I tried to explain what I saw, but the other leaders laughed it off, assuming I was trying to scare them in return. I didn't push it. Whatever it was, I wasn't going to argue about it in that moment. I just kept replaying the image in my mind. The next day, I had to know what it was. I grabbed another leader, and we went back to the area where I had seen the figure. The forest looked innocent in daylight, sun filtering through leaves, birds chirping. Nothing seemed menacing, but as we approached the tree where the man, or whatever it was, had been, I froze. Nailed to the trunk was a dead rabbit, skinned and decomposing, its lifeless body swinging slightly in the breeze. The smell was nauseating. My stomach churned as I processed it. Someone had gone to great lengths to create that grotesque scene. We called the police. They came, looked around briefly, and shrugged it off as a prank by local kids or another scouting group. There were no suspects, no leads, just an unsettling scene that would forever be burned into my memory. No one else in the group saw it, and no other incidents occurred that night, but I couldn't shake the image. I still think about it when I'm in the woods alone, even years later. The way that figure moved, the head banging, the slow, unnatural way it approached, it wasn't just a prank gone wrong. Someone out there had a sense of humor far darker than mine or anyone else's in our group. I tell myself it was just local kids or some sick prank, but deep down, I know there was real danger that night. And the memory of running through that black forest, not knowing if what followed me was human, still makes my chest tighten and my heart race. The rabbit nailed to the tree was proof enough that someone wanted to terrify anyone who stumbled into that part of the woods, and that reality is terrifying enough without adding anything supernatural. I moved into the small guard station in southern Idaho during the early summer, expecting a quiet few months of backcountry work, hiking trails, maintaining signage, and making sure visitors stayed safe. I was the only recreation ranger in the district, which meant I was completely on my own. The nearest town was about an hour and a half away, a drive that always felt longer at night. When I first arrived, the cabin looked small but livable, nestled against a ridge that overlooked a bend in a creek. It had a rustic charm, nothing fancy, but I was used to that. What I wasn't used to was the electricity. The place ran on solar power, and the panels weren't working. The first night I realized I didn't have reliable power, and my cell service was non-existent. I knew I was in for a long season. The cabin had other problems, too. Bats had taken up residence in the rafters, and every night I could hear them fluttering around, occasionally dropping small droppings onto the floor or my bedding. The forest outside had a strange oppressive feeling. I'd spent years in ponderosa forests in the southwest, and I was familiar with the quiet of pine and juniper, the way the wind moved through the needles, the subtle sounds of wildlife. This place was different. The trees were dense and the undergrowth thick. There was always this sense that something was watching, that the woods were waiting. At first I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. A couple months into the job, I began noticing noises on the deck at night. Scratching, light thumps, the sound of something pacing just outside the door. Initially, I thought it was badgers or beavers, which were known in the area, or maybe even a raccoon or coyote. But the noises grew bolder. I'd sometimes step outside with a flashlight and hear nothing. Other times, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye. Something crouched low, moving in the brush. Sleep had been impossible for weeks. The bats weren't helping, and my mind was on edge from exhaustion and the constant feeling of being watched. One Tuesday night, after my weekly grocery run, I parked in front of the cabin, and an overwhelming sense of dread hit me. I didn't have my shotgun in the vehicle. I stepped out, and my eyes immediately caught something off to the right, about 50 feet from the cabin. Two eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, suspended roughly 3.5 to 4 feet off the ground. My stomach dropped. My instincts screamed at me to run back inside, but my legs froze. I shouted, "Get the fuck out of here!" The eyes didn't retreat. Instead, the creature crouched lower, inching closer through the brush. It was clearly large, bigger than a coyote, heavier, built like a predator built to take down something larger than a small deer. My hands trembled as I grabbed a piece of firewood and tossed it in the creature's direction. It leaped back slightly but made no sound, no growl, nothing. I threw a few more pieces, each one landing closer, each one making my heart pound harder. I fumbled with my keys. Of course, the solar power was out again and the porch lights didn't come on. Somehow I got inside, slammed the door, and grabbed my shotgun. Technically, firearms weren't allowed in government housing, but anyone who's ever worked deep backcountry knows better. You don't live alone in the Idaho hills without some means of defending yourself. Stepping back outside, I saw the creature had moved closer, now partially obscured by the trees, but I could make out its form in my headlamp's weak beam. It was solid, muscular, covered in tawny fur, and the way it held itself suggested a predator well accustomed to stalking and killing. I loaded the shotgun, one hand gripping the gun, the other tossing firewood, trying to keep it at bay. Each toss made it hesitate, but it didn't leave. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it backed off and disappeared into the brush. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I didn't sleep that night, except for dozing off occasionally with the shotgun clutched to my chest. 4 IPAs helping me keep my nerves at bay. The next morning, the trail crew arrived to check on the station. We spent the day examining the porch, the rocking bench, the compound, and the creek trail. Mountain lion tracks were everywhere, large paw prints that matched the height and mass of the creature I'd seen the night before. I realized then that I hadn't imagined it. The fear, the eyes in the dark, the stalking, it had all been real. What shook me even more was that after that encounter, I continued hearing movement on the porch, hearing the rocking chair slowly sway as if someone, or something, had just brushed against it. But no new tracks appeared in the muddy soil. The forest seemed aware, alert, watching. Unlike the mountain lions I'd encountered in the past, this presence was patient, intelligent, almost taunting, waiting until I was alone and vulnerable. Over the rest of the season, I learned to live with it. I kept the shotgun within arm's reach at all times, never went out at night alone without it, and kept a mental map of the areas the creature seemed to frequent. I realized the animal was territorial, moving silently, studying me, probably trying to gauge whether I was a threat or prey. I never saw it up close again, but the noises persisted. The porch felt alive in the dead of night, and the weight of those eyes, even in memory, never left me. By the end of the season, I had adapted to the isolation and the constant tension, though it left me exhausted. I knew the forest wasn't haunted, and there were no fairy tales or ghosts lurking. It was just raw nature, and I was a part of it, observed and measured by a predator that had mastered the art of hunting in its domain. When I left the cabin for the last time, locking the door behind me, I felt a strange mix of relief and respect. The woods had tested me, forced me to confront fear in its purest, most tangible form, and I'd survived. That, I realized, was the ending I needed. Clear, grounded, and entirely real. I remember that summer at Philmont like it was etched into my bones. I was 19, part of a crew doing a 2-week backpacking trek across the New Mexico backcountry. Each crew had a ranger assigned to them for the first few days, someone who knew the trails, the dangers, and the rhythms of the wilderness. Our ranger was a wiry man with a quiet confidence, someone who moved through the trees like he belonged there, who could spot the tiniest clue of a trail, a wildlife sign, or a subtle shift in the weather. On our first morning, he walked with us out of the staffed camp, giving us a checklist of essential skills: how to ford streams safely, how to identify edible plants, how to keep our packs balanced for long climbs. He stayed a couple of days to make sure we could handle the terrain, to see if we were going to survive the high country, and then, as he told us, he would vanish into the woods until he reached the next staffed camp. It was on one of these solo hikes back that he told us what happened, and I swear to this day, it's the single most terrifying story I've ever heard about anything in the wilderness that wasn't human. He said he had finished with a crew near a ridge that overlooked a canyon, and the trail back to the pickup point required him to follow a series of game trails through dense forest. He explained that he liked these trails because animals had already carved a path. The brush was worn down, and it often made for quicker travel than hacking through unbroken wilderness. The sun was already low, casting long shadows across the slopes, and the air smelled sharp, dry, and full of pine. He had been walking for about an hour, boots crunching over pine needles, when he noticed movement in the brush behind him. At first he thought it was a deer, the kind that sometimes appeared out of nowhere in the forest, staring at you for a moment before vanishing. But then he saw it step fully into the path. A mountain lion, larger than anything I had imagined outside of pictures, with golden brown fur that blended perfectly with the dry undergrowth. Its eyes caught the light of the setting sun, and he said it felt like the animal was studying him in the way a person studies a puzzle. Patient, calculating. What happened next, he said, is almost impossible to explain if you haven't been there. The mountain lion didn't roar or stalk him aggressively. It didn't crouch or hiss. It walked right up behind him and pressed its body against his legs. Like a domestic cat, he said, curling and rubbing its side, letting him feel its weight and its soft, terrifying power. He froze. Every instinct screamed to move, but the moment he shifted even slightly, the lion would brush harder, scenting him, marking him. He described the sensation as one of total vulnerability, like the animal could see every secret of your body and decide whether you lived or died. In that instant, he said, his body betrayed him completely. That instinctive, uncontrollable fear reaction that made him soil and urinate almost at the same time. He said he had never felt so small, so exposed, so aware of a creature's raw, unfiltered power. And yet, somehow, the lion was playful. It was testing him, gauging him. He described it as an almost casual curiosity, like the animal was as bemused by his fear as he was horrified by its presence. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just let it investigate. Eventually, the animal twitched its tail, flicked its ears, and wandered off into the trees as silently as it had appeared, leaving him alone on the path, shaking. Soaked in his own panic and humiliation, he didn't immediately run. He had learned that in the wilderness, movement can trigger aggression. Instead, he stood there, heart hammering, lungs screaming for air, ears straining for the sound of another step or growl. He waited. The silence of the forest pressed in around him, heavy and unbroken. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he slowly moved forward, one careful step at a time, feeling the weight of the shadows and the echoes of his own heartbeat. He followed the trail the rest of the way down, checking constantly behind him but never seeing the mountain lion again. When he finally reached the staffed camp, dusk had fully settled, and he said he collapsed against a tree exhausted, grateful to be back among the safety of other humans and the faint glow of campfires. He ended the story by telling us that the wilderness doesn't have to be actively hostile to be terrifying. Predators don't need to attack to remind you of your vulnerability. He said it was one of the few times in his life he felt completely powerless, the kind of fear that sticks to you long after the event is over, lingering in your mind like a shadow. But he also emphasized that the experience taught him respect. Respect for the mountain lion, respect for the unpredictability of nature, and respect for his own limitations. He had survived because he kept his wits, because he understood the animal's behavior, and because he didn't panic. That, he said, is the difference between a ranger and someone who ends up as just another cautionary tale in the backcountry. Even years later, when I'm alone in the woods, I remember that story vividly. I remember the tension, the weight of fear pressing down on him. And I remember how the ranger explained that survival isn't about weapons or strength. It's about awareness, patience, and a deep respect for the wild. That story stayed with me longer than the entire trek itself. And every time I see mountain lion tracks in the dirt, I think of him, and I feel that same shiver of primal fear that he must have felt. The knowledge that in nature, you are never entirely in control, and sometimes the most terrifying encounters are the ones where nothing happens at all, but everything is possible. I used to live on the outskirts of a national park, far enough out that when the sun went down, it felt like the world stopped existing beyond the small circle of darkness around my cabin. It was about 4 miles from the nearest paved road, down a dirt path that barely counted as a driveway. You couldn't see another house or even the glow of a neighbor's porch light. It was just endless woods, tall trees pressed tight together, their branches clawing over the sky. The cabin itself was small, barely big enough for 2 people. It had no plumbing, no electricity, and no phone signal. There was a water pump out back that froze half the time and a small gas stove that smoked whenever we used it. The air always smelled like damp wood and pine needles. At night, the silence could get so deep that your own heartbeat sounded too loud. My roommate at the time was interning with the Park Service. He was a good guy, but a city kid through and through. He liked to joke about living off the grid, but I could tell he didn't really understand what that meant until he spent a few nights out there. The dark wasn't just dark, it was suffocating. When the moon wasn't out, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Every sound seemed sharper. Every creak of the wood or snap of a twig made you tense up. After a few weeks, I started noticing something odd. It began with noises at night. I'd be lying in bed, staring up at the wooden ceiling, and I'd hear faint crunching sounds outside. At first I thought it was animals, maybe a deer or a wild hog, but the sounds were rhythmic, like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, spaced out in a way that didn't sound like any animal I knew. The sound would come closer, then stop for long stretches of time, as if whoever or whatever was making them was standing still, listening. I'd sit up in bed, hold my breath, and wait for something else to happen. But then everything would go silent again, and I'd start doubting myself. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was a raccoon. Out there, your mind plays tricks on you. Every shadow looks like something moving. Every gust of wind sounds like a whisper. I told myself that over and over. But the next night it happened again. The same soft crunching of leaves, always at the same time and around 2 or 3 in the morning. Always near the same side of the cabin. The part that started to really get to me was when the sound stopped in certain places. The overgrown patch of brush near the back of the property, or the line of trees by the old fence. Those spots were dense and hard to see through even in daylight. I'd stand at the window in the dark, peering out, trying to see if there was anything there. Sometimes I thought I saw shapes moving, but I could never be sure. The air always felt heavier those nights, like the forest was holding its breath. The cabin didn't even have a proper lock on the door. It was one of those old latch types that could be pushed open if someone tried hard enough. The owners didn't want us to change anything. Said it was part of the charm. But lying there at night with those footsteps outside, knowing that the door couldn't really stop anyone from walking right in, it didn't feel charming at all. Eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I started sleeping in my car instead. The property was huge, so I'd park my car over an acre away from the cabin, far enough that I couldn't see it through the trees. I figured whatever or whoever was making those noises was interested in the cabin, not me. The car felt safer. It locked, it was enclosed, and it gave me some distance. The first night I slept out there, I remember feeling a strange sense of relief. The forest was still, and for the first time in weeks, I actually managed to fall asleep. But a few nights later, I heard it again. Those same footsteps, slow and steady, only this time they were closer to the car. The sound of leaves being pressed down, twigs snapping lightly. It came from the direction of the cabin, moving toward me. I sat up straight in the driver's seat, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The windows were fogged, and I didn't dare wipe them because I didn't want to make noise. The steps stopped just outside the car's range of light. For several minutes, there was nothing, not a single sound. Then, slowly, the footsteps turned and went back the way they came, fading until I couldn't hear them anymore. That was it for me. I packed up my stuff the next morning and left. I told my roommate what had been happening, but he laughed it off. He said I was letting the woods get to me, that it was probably just an animal. I didn't argue. I just drove away. He stayed behind for a few more weeks, still sleeping in that cabin with its useless door. Then he got robbed, twice. The first time, some of his gear went missing. The second time, it was food and a few tools. He called me after that, said he finally believed me. He set up a few motion-activated cameras around the property just to see if he could catch whoever it was. A few days later, he sent me the footage. There was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket and a cap. He had a long rifle slung over his shoulder. In the video, you could see him moving slowly through the trees, crouching in the brush, watching the cabin. The camera caught him several times over different nights, always coming from the same direction, always staying just far enough back to not be noticed from inside. Sometimes he'd stand completely still for minutes at a time, facing the windows. Then he'd turn and disappear into the woods. No one ever caught him. The police said there wasn't enough to go on, and by the time they went out there, the man was long gone. But seeing that footage made everything I'd heard make sense. The footsteps, the pauses in the thick brush, the feeling of being watched. It had never been my imagination. Someone had been there, hiding in the woods, watching us night after night. I still think about it sometimes, about how long he might have been doing that before I even noticed. How many nights I lay there in that cabin while he stood just a few yards away, watching from the dark. I moved to the city not long after that, and I've never gone back to that property. But sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night and the house is quiet, I still listen for those footsteps, just to make sure they're not there. I wasn't a park ranger or anything like that. Just a regular person trying to see a bit of nature with a friend. It was early autumn, and we were hiking in Andorra. The air had that cold, sharp edge that stings your lungs a little when you breathe in too deep, and the trees were turning golden red in the valleys. The plan was simple: follow a marked trail, loop around before sunset, grab a bus back to the small village we were staying in. But things like that always sound simpler than they actually are once you're out there. We started early that morning, a bit overconfident. The trail markers in Andorra are good, but at some point we must have missed one while talking or looking around. I remember walking down a slope, the ground slick with wet leaves, and noticing the trail getting narrower. We assumed it would reconnect somewhere below, but after another hour we realized it wasn't going to. The forest opened into a clearing, and there was a stream running through it that didn't match anything we had seen on the map earlier. My phone had no service, and my friend's battery had already died. We were somewhere deep in the hills between Andorra and Spain, and neither of us could tell which side of the border we were on anymore. We kept walking south, figuring eventually we'd hit a road or another marked trail. The forest in that area is dense, but the ground rises and falls in slow, rolling waves, so you always feel like you're almost out of it. It gives you this constant false hope. The light started to fade a bit, not sunset yet, but that dull afternoon tone where everything looks slightly blue. That's when we spotted the other trail, a wider one, hard-packed, with clear footprints and tire tracks from bicycles. It felt like we'd stumbled onto something solid again. We followed it downhill. Not long after, we saw someone ahead, a man walking in the same direction we were with two golden retrievers. He looked young from behind, maybe mid-30s, and was carrying some kind of climbing gear slung over one shoulder. The dogs were running back and forth, sometimes disappearing into the trees but always returning to him. They looked happy, like they knew where they were going. The sight of another person after being lost half the day hit me like relief. We picked up the pace to catch up, my legs already sore and my throat dry from not drinking enough water. By the time we reached him, sweat was sticking my shirt to my back even in the cool air. The man looked friendly enough. He told us exactly where we were, even pointed out the direction of a nearby town, and then another one a bit farther with a hotel. He mentioned his car was parked at the smaller town, only 6 kilometers ahead. He said he could give us a lift the rest of the way. That was the best thing we could have heard all day. We started walking together, our spirits up again. The dogs ran circles around us, brushing against my legs now and then, panting happily. One of them kept carrying a stick in its mouth, dropping it and picking it up again. The man walked with a steady pace, fast but not rushed, like someone who knew these hills well. He talked easily, and we tried to keep up, but the trail started to descend more steeply, our knees burning from the constant downward pressure. My friend was limping slightly from a blister, and soon we began to lag behind. I remember watching his back as he moved ahead, dark jacket, the climbing gear swinging with each step, the dogs darting around him. Then the trail curved to the right, wrapping around a steep hill. We could still hear the jingle of the dogs' collars faintly, but we were maybe a minute behind him. When we finally rounded the bend, the sound was gone. The trail ahead stretched straight for at least a few hundred meters, open enough that we should have seen him easily. There were no side paths, no rocky ledges, just a clear dirt track cutting through sparse pine trees. But he wasn't there. We stopped and scanned around, expecting maybe he'd stepped off to the side to let the dogs roam. Nothing. No voices, no movement. Even the usual background noise of the forest seemed quieter, like the air had gone still. We walked faster, half expecting him to appear around the next dip in the path. But he didn't. It felt wrong, not frightening exactly. Just confusing and heavy in that way your stomach feels when you realize something doesn't add up. We kept walking, saying nothing for a while. The sun was lower now, light slanting through the trees in thin golden lines. Every now and then I turned to look behind us, just to make sure no one was following, though I wasn't sure why I felt the need to. My friend looked uneasy too, like both of us were trying to act normal but failing. It wasn't just that the man had vanished, it was how silent it had gotten after he did. Even the birds seemed to have gone somewhere else. We walked for what felt like hours before the forest began to thin. A few rooftops appeared through the trees, then a small road, and finally a cluster of houses, the smaller town he had mentioned. I remember scanning every parked car, looking for a vehicle that might belong to someone carrying climbing gear. None of them matched what I expected. There were a few dusty vans, a couple of small hatchbacks, but no sign of him or the dogs. We stopped at a fountain to drink and rest. My legs felt like they were on fire, and my hands were shaking slightly. Part of me wanted to wait around, see if he showed up, but the thought of standing still out there made me uneasy. So we kept going, following the road toward the bigger town he had said was 12 kilometers away. It took another few hours before we reached it, long after the sun had gone down. The hotel lights looked unreal after so much time in the dim woods. Inside the room, the warmth hit me all at once. I sat on the bed, trying to piece everything together. We kept replaying it in our heads, the way we had followed him, how close we'd been, how there was nowhere for him to go that quickly. I told myself maybe there was a side trail we didn't see, or maybe he'd cut through the trees with the dogs. Maybe he'd been in a hurry and just didn't want us tagging along anymore. But when I thought about how quiet it got after he disappeared, how the air had shifted and the woods had felt strange, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about that moment was deeply off. The next morning, we checked a map and found that the trail we'd been on wasn't even an official one. It looked like an old access route that led toward an abandoned climbing site. Maybe he'd gone down there, maybe we'd simply missed it. But no matter how much sense I tried to make of it, that moment when we turned the corner and he was just gone stayed burned in my mind. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm hiking and see someone walking ahead on a trail. That feeling of trying to catch up, of knowing you're only a few steps behind, and then turning a corner to find nothing but empty ground, it lingers. It reminds you how quickly people can vanish in the wild, how easily a few seconds can erase all trace of someone. We never saw him again, never found out who he was or where he'd gone. Maybe he reached his car. Maybe we walked past the place he'd turned off without realizing. Or maybe he just moved faster than we could understand. Whatever it was, that empty trail still plays in my head like it never really ended. Just kept going into the trees, quiet and endless, long after we stopped walking. I was camping in the Everglades, a little deeper than I probably should have gone. I liked the isolation, the quiet, the thick air that made the nights feel heavier. I parked my car, a convertible with a cloth top, on a patch of flat ground near the edge of a small clearing. The ground was soft, a mix of mud and dry leaves, and even though it was December, it was still warm and humid. The kind of heat that sticks to your skin even after the sun's gone down. Because of my back problems, I never sleep in a tent anymore. The car's back seat was flatter, more stable, and it kept me off the damp ground. I laid out a thin sleeping pad and a blanket, cracked the windows to let the air move, and listened to the swamp hum and buzz around me. The Everglades at night never really go quiet. There's always something moving, a frog croaking, a branch snapping, insects whirring in the dark. You hear it so long that you start to notice small patterns in the chaos, like there's a rhythm to the swamp you only catch when you stay still enough. I must have drifted off for an hour or so when I heard a faint scuffling sound directly above me. It took me a second to realize it wasn't just the trees shifting. It was on the roof. Something was walking across the cloth top of my car. I froze for a moment, trying to figure out how heavy it sounded. It wasn't light and quick like a squirrel. It was heavier, steady. I guessed it was a raccoon. They're common out there, and I'd left a cooler and a loaf of bread in the back compartment. So it made sense that one had smelled something. The sound of its claws pressing and dragging lightly across the fabric made my skin crawl. I could feel the roof give a little with its weight. I imagined those sharp little claws poking through, tearing the cloth, and I'd be stuck with a hole I couldn't fix out here. So I pushed upward with my hand, just a gentle shove to spook it off. I heard a quick scrabble of claws and then silence. I thought that was it. A few minutes later, the steps came back. Same slow, deliberate pacing across the roof, like it was testing the area again. I pushed harder this time, right where the sound came from, and the weight shifted away. I could hear it drop off onto the hood, then a faint thud as it hit the ground. I waited, listening to see if it would circle around. but the swamp filled the silence again. This back and forth went on for what felt like an hour. The raccoon would leave, then come back, as if it was determined to find a way inside. Each time I could hear its weight pressing on different parts of the top, and I'd shove upward until it ran off. The fabric creaked and flexed under my hand, and I kept imagining the sound of a rip, soft but final, ruining the car's only protection. Then, after a long stretch of quiet, it stopped coming back. The swamp sounds returned to their usual rhythm, and I finally started to relax again. I was half asleep when I heard a new sound, different this time. It wasn't above me. It was in front of me, closer to the front seats. A faint shuffle, something brushing against plastic or fabric. I opened my eyes slowly, still groggy, and saw the outline of something moving in the dim light coming through the windows. There, in the driver's seat, was the raccoon. It was sitting upright, its little hands resting on the edge of the seat, staring back at me over the top. The light from outside caught its eyes, making them glint in the dark. For a second, I didn't move. It didn't either. We just stayed there looking at each other. It must have climbed in through the open window while I'd been trying to sleep. Instinct kicked in, and I lurched forward, trying to shoo it out. It scrambled, claws scraping against the seat and dashboard, before leaping out through the window. I sat there breathing hard, half annoyed, half unsettled. My heart was pounding, not because it was dangerous, it wasn't, but because of the suddenness of it. 1 second of calm, and then that strange face staring at me in the dark. I knew I wasn't getting any sleep after that, so I decided to get out and walk to the bathroom nearby. The air outside was thick and still, the ground soft under my shoes. I kept my flashlight low, watching for snakes. The bathrooms were about 100 yards away, near a cluster of trees. Inside, the fluorescent light flickered weakly, casting pale reflections on the concrete floor. I washed my face, used the toilet, and took my time just to shake off the weird feeling. When I got back to the car, I didn't notice anything unusual right away. I checked the windows. They were still open a crack. I didn't see the raccoon anywhere, so I figured that was the end of it. Eventually, I fell asleep again, though it was restless. Every little noise made me half wake up, thinking it was back. The next morning, the air was hazy with humidity. A layer of mist hovered low over the ground, and everything smelled faintly of wet earth and old leaves. I stepped out of the car and stretched my back, still feeling the stiffness from the night. I looked around, just taking in the stillness of the morning. That's when I noticed something odd under a tree about 20 feet away, a crumpled plastic wrapper lying in the dirt. I walked over and recognized it instantly. It was the wrapper from the loaf of bread I'd brought, the one I had tucked into the compartment behind the back seat where the convertible top folds in. The wrapper was completely empty, flattened and torn. I looked back at the car and saw small muddy paw prints on the side, a clear trail leading from the ground up to the rear quarter panel. Somehow, while I was gone, the raccoon had climbed back into the car again and dragged the whole loaf out with him. 18 slices of double fiber bread. Gone. I couldn't help but laugh a little, even though I was annoyed. I could picture the raccoon sitting somewhere out there in the trees, bloated and miserable after stuffing himself full of it. That much fiber in one sitting had to be a nightmare for his stomach. I imagined him waddling through the swamp, regretting every bite, and it weirdly made me feel bad for him. For the rest of that morning, I packed up slowly, double-checking every corner of the car. I found a few crumbs near the seat, a couple of tiny claw marks on the upholstery, and one small rip in the cloth top where I'd pushed against it too hard during the night. Nothing serious, but enough to remind me how fragile the setup really was out here. The Everglades weren't dangerous in the way people usually think. No ghost stories, no monsters, but everything that lived there was always trying to get what it needed to survive, even if it meant creeping into your car while you slept. As I drove out later that morning, windows down, I kept glancing at the trees and the sawgrass that blurred past. Somewhere out there, that raccoon was probably nursing the worst stomachache of his life, and I couldn't shake the image of him sitting still, staring at the car just like he had the night before. The thought was funny, but also strange in its own quiet way. Out there, you learn quickly that you're just another creature passing through, and the swamp doesn't care much about you. It just keeps moving, one night after another, full of sounds that never stop. I've been working as a ranger at a remote desert park for a few years now. It's one of those places that looks beautiful in pictures but feels lonely in person. Endless dirt roads, rocky ridges that glow red at sunset, and stretches of sand that look like they go on forever. The air always feels dry enough to crack your skin, and during summer, you can stand outside for 10 minutes and feel the heat cooking through your boots. Most visitors come in spring or fall. In the summer months, it's quiet, dead quiet. Sometimes weeks go by without anyone checking in at the visitor station. Just the occasional border patrol truck cutting through the park, or a lost traveler running low on gas. When I first started, I heard stories from the older rangers. Things they'd seen or found out in the desert that made you think twice about the kind of people who passed through here. But one story stuck with me more than the others. It happened a few years before I was hired, at one of our southern campgrounds. That place barely gets used anymore. No shade, no water, and no cell signal. Just a few picnic tables and a single dirt road leading in and out. During the off-season, the maintenance ranger at the time went out there to do a routine patrol. He said the place looked abandoned, like it usually did that time of year. But when he drove through one of the last loops, he saw a burnt-out car sitting in one of the sites. Nothing strange about abandoned cars out here. People dump them all the time when they break down. Still, he stopped to check. He said the air smelled like burnt rubber and something else, something thicker and heavier that clung to your throat when you breathed. The car was blackened to a shell, windows melted, frame warped from the heat. The desert around it was scorched in a wide circle, the sand still darkened where the fire had burned hottest. He could tell it had been there for a while, maybe days. The inside looked like a cave, everything melted together, and then through the open driver's side, he saw what was left of a person, or what used to be one. No arms, no legs, just a torso and head, charred black. The skull had cracked from the heat. The torso was slumped forward like it had been trying to fall out of the seat. The ranger didn't touch anything. He just got back to his truck, called the sheriff's office, and waited. When the sheriff showed up with a couple deputies, they took a quick look and decided it was suicide. No investigation, no caution tape. Just a few photos and a tow truck to haul the car away. That's what I was told. The sheriff's department didn't seem interested. They said things like that happened. People crossing the border, drug mules, human traffickers, or smugglers who got caught in something bad. Out here, people disappear all the time. The desert swallows them up. The story bothered me, not because of how the man died, but because of how easily everyone seemed to move on. The sheriff called it suicide, but no one could explain how a man without arms and legs could have burned himself alive inside a locked car. No one even tried. The report was short, just a couple sentences about a deceased male found in vehicle. The car was towed to impound, and that was the end of it. When I started working there, I used to drive out to that same campground sometimes. Not for any real reason, just to see it. It's about an hour from the main station, down a washboard dirt road that rattles your teeth. The place still looks forgotten. The picnic tables are rusted and half buried in sand. The fire pit's filled with wind-blown trash. The site where they found the car is empty now. The sand there looks darker, like it still remembers what happened. Every time I walk by, I think about that man sitting in his car. The flames eating through metal and flesh. The heat so intense that nothing around it could survive. One afternoon, near the end of my shift, I was checking the same area again. It was mid-July, the kind of day where the air feels heavy and your throat dries out even when you're drinking water. I pulled over near the site to stretch my legs. The place was completely still, no wind, no birds, no sound except for the hum of the truck's engine cooling. Then I noticed something out near the road, half buried in the sand. It was a small piece of metal, sun-bleached and rusted around the edges. When I dug it out, I realized it was a part of a license plate. The last few letters were barely visible. I thought about turning it in, but I didn't. I just put it back down and covered it with sand again. It didn't matter anymore. The man, whoever he was gone, and no one ever came asking about him. Not once. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how easy it is for people to disappear out here. You could burn an entire car, body and all, and within a week the desert would cover it up again. Sand would fill the footprints, wind would scatter the ashes, and it would be like nothing ever happened. I started thinking about all the times I'd been out there alone, driving miles from anyone else, my radio barely working. How many other cars were out there, half buried, never found? How many people never made it back? A few months later I went out there again. This time I found tire tracks in the sand leading into the campground. They didn't belong to any of our vehicles. I followed them to the same site where the burnt car had been years before. The tracks stopped there. No sign of another car leaving, no footprints, no trash, just tire marks ending abruptly in the middle of that blackened patch of earth. I stood there for a long time, trying to figure it out. The desert was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I checked the horizon, but there was nothing moving. No dust trail, no sound. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the ground. I looked at the dark sand again and thought maybe the desert didn't just swallow people. It remembered them in its own way. Not through ghosts or hauntings, but through marks and traces that never fully go away. I drove back to the station before dark. Didn't report the tracks. Didn't mention the plate. It didn't feel worth it. Around here things like that happen and nobody asks questions. The sheriff wouldn't care. The desert keeps its secrets, and the longer I work out here, the more I realize that's how it's always been. Now every time I go on patrol, I can't help thinking about that burnt car. About the man they found with no arms and no legs, sitting there in the driver's seat as the flames closed in. Whether it was a suicide or not doesn't even matter anymore. What matters is how easy it was for everyone to move on. The desert didn't care. The sheriff didn't care. And after a while, neither did anyone else. That's the kind of place this is. Things die, burn, and disappear, and the wind blows over like it never happened. I still go out there sometimes, park the truck, and just sit there for a few minutes. I don't know why. Maybe to remind myself how fast everything can vanish out here. Maybe to make sure I don't. When my cousin invited me to tag along with her for a hydrology trip in the Montana and Wyoming area, I jumped at the chance. I'd been feeling stuck in routine for months, so when she said she'd be camping out in the wilderness for a couple of days to test water sources, I thought it sounded like exactly the kind of reset I needed. She worked for the Forest Service, the type of job that always seemed rough around the edges but deeply rewarding. I didn't work in forestry, but the idea of getting out there, away from everything man-made, was appealing in a way I didn't expect. I wanted to see what her work was like, what it meant to go off-grid for real. We rode out early the first morning, both on horses since the terrain she worked in was the kind where trucks or ATVs weren't much use. The trail was soft from recent rain, the air sharp and clean. You could taste how fresh it was. The horses' breathing mixed with the rhythmic sound of hooves pressing into the dirt, and every so often a crow would cut through the silence, calling out across the valley. It was slow going but beautiful in a way that pictures don't ever capture. The forest up there doesn't feel like the kind you hike in for fun. It feels alive in a heavy, almost watchful way. The kind of silence where every sound stands out, like the whole landscape is holding its breath. We made camp near a creek that first night. My cousin did most of the setup since she knew what she was doing, but I helped where I could. The water was clear enough to see pebbles and the small fish darting under them. I remember sitting by the fire that night, eating freeze-dried food out of a pouch, thinking how small everything felt. It wasn't scary then, just peaceful. The kind of peace that almost feels unreal if you're used to living around people. The stars were bright, sharp enough to almost make you dizzy if you looked too long. I fell asleep with that quiet pressing in on me, feeling lucky to be there. The next day, after testing a few small streams and checking runoff samples, my cousin asked if I wanted to see something strange. She said it casually, like it was nothing big, but there was something in her tone that made me curious. We veered off the planned route and started following a narrow path that wound between thick clusters of pine. The trail got rougher the further we went, and the trees started to crowd in tighter. The smell of sap and dirt got stronger, and at some point, The sun dimmed enough under the canopy that it felt like late afternoon even though it wasn't. It took us about 2 hours of slow, careful riding to get to this little ravine she was leading me to. When we stopped, we were surrounded by trees that seemed taller than the rest we'd passed. The place felt strangely untouched. The kind of area you could walk through 100 times and still miss if you didn't know where to look. The ground dipped slightly, forming a natural bowl with soft moss and low brush. She tied up her horse, so I did the same, and we started walking through the clearing. I carried the small radio she'd brought along. It was one of those crank radios that doubles as a lantern. I'd thought it was overkill earlier, but she said it came in handy when you were miles from anywhere. She told me to follow this faint wildlife path that disappeared between 2 thick clusters of spruce. I stepped over a few downed branches, pushing through some shrubs until I saw what she wanted to show me. In the middle of that patch of trees, half covered in leaves and dirt, was a coil of electrical wire sticking straight out of the ground. It wasn't industrial cable or anything huge, just something like you'd find in a house wall, maybe 10 or 12 gauge. It didn't make any sense being there. I crouched down, brushed off some of the dirt, and saw it was insulated copper wire. It snaked out of the ground, wrapped loosely around a root, then trailed off into the woods. I followed it because, honestly, what else would you do when you see something like that in the middle of nowhere? The wire ran from the ground to a branch, looping over it, then dropped back to the dirt and disappeared under a rock before popping out again on the other side. It went like that for maybe 50 yards, up, down, twisting around trees and stones, until I came to a small clearing. That's where I saw it, an old-school desk sitting dead in the center of the clearing, the kind with a metal base and a laminate top that was scratched and peeling. The wire ran straight into a mounted outlet box that was attached to the side of the desk. It was completely alone out there. No road, no sign of any structure, no trash or debris, nothing that suggested anyone had set up camp or done work there. Just this single desk, weathered but still standing, and a live-looking outlet in the middle of the forest. I remember standing there, trying to make sense of it. My brain went through every possible explanation it could come up with. Some kind of research setup, maybe, or remnants of an old experiment, maybe even a prank someone had set up years ago. But there was nothing else around. No wires going further. No generator. No poles. Nothing that would explain how it could possibly have power. I heard my cousin walking up behind me, crunching through the leaves, and then the soft hum of the radio in her hands. She plugged it in. I didn't even think it would fit, but it did. The second the plug went in, the radio crackled to life, buzzing with static so loud it startled me. It was the kind of static that rises and falls like it's catching something faint, like voices too far to hear. She turned it down quickly, but we both knew what that meant. The outlet was live. There was electricity running through that wire from somewhere deep enough that we couldn't see or guess where it was coming from. We stood there for a long time. It didn't feel spooky in the classic sense, just deeply wrong, like seeing something that shouldn't exist in a place untouched by people. I tried to think of any rational reason. Maybe an old research station used to be there, maybe a buried line that had been forgotten, maybe some long-abandoned forest project. But even those didn't fit. There were no remnants of anything, no posts, no foundation, no cut logs, no tire tracks. The desk wasn't even half buried the way you'd expect if it had been there for years. It looked placed there, like someone had just set it down and left. We didn't linger long after that. The light was starting to fade, and I remember feeling uneasy for the first time on the trip. As we rode back to our camp, I kept thinking about that wire buried somewhere under our feet, running who knows how far. It wasn't fear exactly, more like confusion that sat heavy in the chest. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the creek outside, I kept picturing that desk sitting quietly out there, the outlet still alive, humming faintly to itself in the dark. In the morning, before we packed up to head back, I told her I wanted to go back and take a picture of it. She shook her head. We had a tight schedule, and besides, she said it was better to leave it be. I didn't argue. On the ride out, I kept glancing behind me, even though I knew there was nothing there. Just endless trees and valleys that seemed to swallow everything. We never talked about it again after that trip. I've gone camping plenty since, even been back to the same general area once, but I've never seen that ravine again. Sometimes, when I think about it, what bothers me most isn't that there was a live outlet out there. It's that someone went through the trouble of putting it there, miles from any road or power line, and for some reason, they left it behind, still working. It had been years since I'd last spoken to him. We'd gone to college together back when life felt open and wide before time started slipping through the cracks of routine and distance. He was a geology major back then, always out on field trips, coming back sunburnt and dusty, talking about rock formations and soil layers with the same excitement that other people reserved for sports. After graduation, I went one way, and he went another, ended up joining the National Park Service somewhere down in the southeast. I can't remember exactly which state, one of those heavy, humid ones where the trees seem to sweat in summer and the air hangs thick even at night. About 8 or 9 years ago, I remember him telling me about something that had happened on the job. It was one of those stories that stuck with me, not because it was violent or shocking in the usual way, but because of the quiet, human strangeness of it. He'd said it started with an older couple that came into the park a few days in a row. They stood out to him because they didn't look like the usual tourists or hikers. They weren't there for the exercise or to take photos for social media. They looked tired, like people who were walking through memories instead of trails. They told him they were visiting from out west and had gotten engaged in that same park decades before. They were trying to find the exact spot where it had happened, some clearing near a river where they'd taken pictures all those years ago. They had a few old photographs with them, faded and curled from time, showing a younger version of themselves smiling near a wide bend in the water. He said it wasn't easy to pinpoint the place because the park had changed over time. New growth, different trails, parts of it closed off or eroded, but he liked the idea of helping them find it. He said it felt like something good to do, something simple and decent. After looking at the pictures and checking the old maps, he thought he knew roughly where they were trying to go. He drove them in his ranger vehicle part of the way, then parked and hiked with them through a narrow path that followed the river downstream. It was late afternoon, the kind of light that turns everything gold for a few minutes before fading to gray. The couple walked slowly, holding hands, stopping to take in the view every now and then. He said they didn't talk much, and he didn't press them for conversation. They just seemed peaceful, like they were where they needed to be. Eventually he found a bend in the river that matched the old photo. The slope of the trees, the shape of the rocks, even the way the light hit the water, it all lined up. When he told me about it, he said he felt a quiet satisfaction seeing the recognition on their faces. They smiled, looked around, and just stood there for a while. He said goodbye, told them to be careful getting back, and hiked back up to his vehicle to head to his station. That's where things started to shift. He told me that as he drove back, he had this odd feeling in his chest, like something unfinished or unsettled. He brushed it off at first, thinking it was just fatigue or the leftover humidity sticking to him, but when he got to the ranger station, he couldn't shake it. He said it wasn't panic, not even worry exactly, just this deep sense that he shouldn't leave until he'd seen them go. He kept glancing out toward the road that led to the main exit, half expecting to see their car roll by. But the sun went down, the other visitors left, and the lot grew empty. He waited a while longer, telling himself maybe they had taken their time hiking back or stopped for pictures. But as it got dark and he needed to start closing up, he realized they still hadn't come through. He radioed his assistant, told him to wait at the entrance shack just in case the couple showed up, and then he drove back out toward the river. The park was silent at night except for the insects and the occasional sound of water shifting through the rocks. He parked and walked in with his flashlight, following the same path they'd taken earlier. He said the trail felt different at night. The air was cooler but heavy, and the beam of his light seemed to fall shorter than usual, like the darkness was swallowing it. When he reached the bend by the river, he saw them almost immediately. They were lying down on the bank close to the water, spooning together on a blanket. He knew before he even got close that they were gone. There was something about how still they were, how the scene seemed too composed. He called it in, did everything by the book. The local authorities came, taped off the area, asked questions. He stayed until late, giving his statement, explaining how he'd helped them find the spot and left them there earlier in the day. They asked if he had seen or heard anything strange, if he noticed anyone else around. He said no, it was just them. After they were taken away, he drove home in silence. He said the whole ride back, he couldn't get over how peaceful they had looked. It didn't seem like violence or fear had touched them. It was just two people who had decided they were done. A few days later, the police contacted him with more information. The woman had been terminally ill, some late-stage cancer that had left her with little time. They had come to the park deliberately to end things together, taking a mixture of pills and chemicals that would stop their breathing quietly. It made sense then, in a way. They had wanted to do it where their life together had started, back at the place where they had gotten engaged. He said it didn't haunt him exactly, but it stayed with him. He wasn't angry or even heartbroken about it, just reflective. He understood why they hadn't told him what they were planning. They probably thought that if they did, he'd have been obligated to stop them, to call for help. He said that in a strange way, he felt honored that they trusted him enough to let him lead them there without suspicion. But the weight of it lingered. Every time he went down that trail afterward, he couldn't help but glance toward the bend in the river, half expecting to see that blanket still there. He said the Park Service later cleared the area, but he could never quite look at that spot the same. He told me it wasn't fear that he felt. Not really. It was more like a quiet emptiness, the kind that comes from witnessing something too personal for words. He said he sometimes thought about how many people visit parks chasing memories, trying to reconnect with old moments, unaware of how final those memories might become. Years later, I still think about that story. I can see him standing there in the dim light, looking down at that couple by the water, hearing only the slow rush of the river beside them. There's something unsettling about how quiet death can be when it's chosen, how it can look almost peaceful, even beautiful, if you don't know what you're seeing at first. He said he stopped going near that trail after a while, transferred to a different park eventually. But every now and then, he'd get that same feeling, the one that hit him that evening when he drove away. The sense that someone was still out there waiting to be found, standing in the middle of an old memory that never really fades. And though he'd seen plenty of deaths in his time as a ranger, that one stayed closest, not because of horror or blood or tragedy, but because of how quietly it all ended. Two people lying side by side, in the same place they'd begun, with no one around except the steady sound of the river moving past them, carrying their last moment away. It was late summer of 2016 when my boyfriend, who's now my husband, and I decided to take a small camping trip in eastern Pennsylvania. We had both been working long hours and wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere far away from the noise and constant phone notifications. We looked for a place that was free and remote, something primitive with no crowds, no cell service, just woods and silence. The spot we found was just that. It was one of those pull-off areas deep in the forest where you could still make out an old uneven road cutting through thick trees. The grass was wet from recent rain, and the ground was soft, slick mud that made the car tires slide if we weren't careful. It wasn't ideal, but it was secluded, and that was exactly what we wanted. The first strange moment came not long after we entered that area. There was an old truck parked off to the side of the road, half on the shoulder and half in a patch of weeds. The hood was popped open, and a woman stood beside it. She was wearing a dark jacket, jeans, and had her hair pulled back. I remember the way she was standing, arms crossed, not really looking at the engine but more in our direction. Normally my boyfriend was the kind of person who'd stop to help without a second thought, but this time he didn't even slow down. Later he said there was something about her that didn't sit right with him. She didn't look nervous or helpless, just expectant, like she was waiting for us to stop. He said she didn't even wave us down or look hopeful like someone who needed help would. I hadn't thought much of it at that moment, but the image stuck in my head, her still, her eyes following our car as we passed. We drove for another half hour before deciding on a spot to set up camp. The ground was still muddy, but there was a clearing with enough dry space to pitch our tent and make a small fire. We parked the car just a few feet away and started unpacking. It was quiet, just the hum of insects and the occasional dripping from trees still shedding water from the earlier rain. While we were setting up the fire pit and gathering wood, I noticed a car drive by on the road in the distance. It was an older model sedan, dark color, hard to tell exactly what make. It slowed down a little as it passed. Then about 15 minutes later, it came by again. The man inside looked at us each time he passed. My boyfriend pointed it out after the second time and said he thought it was the same car. The third time it came by, there was no mistaking it. Same car, same guy, just moving slower. The windows were rolled down, and even though it was getting close to dusk, I could see the outline of his face staring toward us. He didn't stop, didn't say anything, just drove by again. After that, he didn't return, but it had already made us both uneasy. We debated whether we should move to another site, but the road was getting slicker and darker, and we had already unpacked. Plus, we told ourselves he was probably doing the same thing we had been, looking for a decent dry spot to set up camp. We tried to shake it off and just enjoy the evening. We roasted hot dogs, listened to the quiet, and watched the woods slowly darken around us. When the fire burned down to embers, we doused it with water, left the ashes smoking lightly, and crawled into the tent. The air smelled like wet earth and pine, and the night was perfectly still. At some point in the night, I woke up. My phone was dead because there was no service, so I had no idea what time it was. My boyfriend stirred beside me, and a moment later I heard it too. A deep, mechanical noise echoing through the trees. It was loud and sudden, a kind of churning metallic sound that came and went in bursts. It didn't sound like any animal or machine I could place. The closest thing I can think of is if you dragged a shovel across gravel and amplified it through a loudspeaker. It came again, lasting longer this time, followed by a still silence that made the woods seem completely dead. My boyfriend shifted and looked through the small mesh window, his body tense. The noise came again, slightly closer this time, then stopped. I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears. I didn't say a word, and for a while, neither did he. Then he reached for my hand and held it tight. I stayed completely still, trying to make sense of what I was hearing, trying to convince myself it was something harmless. Maybe a distant generator or some kind of old machine at a nearby property. It sounded mechanical, but the woods were thick and deep. It didn't make sense for it to be so close. After a few more minutes of silence, I heard faint crunching noises. Leaves shifting. It could have been an animal, but the steps sounded too slow, too deliberate. My boyfriend didn't move, but I could tell he was listening hard. The air inside the tent felt thick, like we were holding our breath together. I remember staring at the ceiling of the tent, my eyes barely open, waiting for something else to happen. After what felt like hours, he whispered for me to get dressed. His voice was low and strained, and that's when I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I sat up, pulling on my jacket and shoes as quietly as I could. He reached beside him and unwrapped the machete we had bought for the trip, still new in its plastic sheath. That's when I realized how serious he was. I could hear my heart pounding as he unzipped the tent, just enough to peek outside. The forest was still, and the moonlight was bright enough to make out the outline of trees in our car. Nothing moved. We packed up in silence, our hands shaking, trying to make as little noise as possible. The fire pit was cold, just ashes and a few half-burnt sticks. When we loaded the last of our things into the car, I noticed something near the pit. A beer can, dented and muddy, sitting right beside where we'd cooked earlier. We hadn't brought beer. I stood there staring at it for a second before my boyfriend noticed and pulled me toward the car. I don't know why that small detail hit me harder than anything else, but it did. Someone had been there. We drove off fast, the tires slipping on the wet road, headlights cutting through fog and trees. Neither of us spoke for the first few miles. The road was empty and narrow, and every bend made my chest tighten, like we might see headlights behind us at any moment. After a while, he told me quietly that he thought someone might have been walking around our site earlier, but he didn't want to scare me at the time. He said the sound we heard hadn't been far away at all. It had been close, maybe just down the road from where we camped. He hadn't wanted to run right away in case someone was trying to lure us out. We didn't stop driving until we reached a main road with streetlights and signs of life again. Only then did we pull over, our hands still trembling. The gas tank was fine, nothing tampered with, but both of us couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if we'd stayed in that tent even an hour longer. The rest of our trip we avoided anything remote. We only camped at busy campgrounds or got a hotel. It took me months before I could sleep outdoors again. Even now, when we go hiking, I find myself watching the tree line and listening for that same metallic sound. It's been years, but that night still feels close. The woman on the road, the man in the car, the noise in the woods, the beer can by the ashes. I'll never know if they were connected or just coincidences, but I've never gone camping anywhere without people nearby again. I had just turned 30 and had been working as a park ranger for 5 years, mostly in small, out-of-the-way districts where the nearest town was more than an hour away. In the summer of 2019, I was assigned to a remote section of the Bitterroot National Forest in western Montana. The district was huge, covering dense pine forests, steep ridges, and a network of old logging roads that hadn't been maintained in decades. I was the only ranger stationed there, living in a small, aging guard station that had been built in the 1960s. It had electricity, but the wiring was old and unreliable, and solar panels had been installed decades ago and rarely worked. Water came from a spring a few hundred meters downhill, and I had to filter it before drinking. From the first night, things felt off. I had moved in during early July. The days were hot and the nights were cold, with the kind of wind that whipped through the trees and made them sound alive. The woods around the station were dense, almost claustrophobic, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. I hadn't had a proper night's sleep since moving in. My old mattress creaked, the windows rattled when the wind blew, and at least 3 times a night, I was sure something was walking across the deck outside. At first I thought it was deer or elk, but the sounds were heavier, deliberate, like someone or something was pacing. I set up a motion sensor camera on the porch, and when I checked the footage in the morning, it showed nothing. Work was exhausting. I had to patrol hundreds of miles of trails and forest roads, check for illegal hunting, keep an eye on campers, and maintain the old fire watch towers. There were stretches of road where my truck wouldn't start because of the dust and rough terrain. On one patrol, I discovered a series of old traps that had clearly been set for bears or large game illegally. They were crude, dangerous, and left in areas where hikers could easily get caught. I carefully documented everything, knowing I'd have to report it when I finally drove into town. One night, after a 12-hour patrol, I was returning to the station. The sun had set over the ridges, leaving a thin orange line on the horizon. My headlights barely penetrated the darkness, and the forest felt like it was closing in on the road. Around a sharp bend, I noticed something strange. A small fire burning just off the road, probably 50 feet into the trees. Smoke curled into the night air. I slowed my truck, heart racing. At first I thought it was another camper, but there was no campsite, no tent, no vehicle. Just a fire burning in a small clearing, perfectly round and neatly contained. I stopped, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out of the truck. The air was still, almost unnaturally so, and the fire crackled quietly. I scanned the trees around me. There was nothing. No movement, no sound, except for the fire. I approached cautiously, flashlight beam cutting through the blackness. The closer I got, the more I realized that this wasn't just a random fire. Around the small circle, there were tracks in the dirt. Too big for a deer, too deep to be a small animal. They were human-sized, but the spacing was odd. Like whoever or whatever had been walking there had an uneven gait. I froze. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I knew I couldn't just abandon the area. I checked the perimeter with the flashlight, shining it into every shadow, but found nothing. Then I heard it, the sound of branches snapping in the underbrush behind me. I spun around, shining the beam toward the noise. Nothing. I took a few careful steps back toward my truck, my heart pounding. Every rustle, Every whisper of wind felt like movement right behind me. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking. I started the engine and drove back to the station as fast as the dirt roads would allow. For the rest of the night, I sat awake in the guard station, gun within reach, listening to the trees sway and imagining shapes moving just beyond the window. I didn't sleep. When morning came, I drove back to the spot. The fire had been completely extinguished. No ash, no traces, nothing. The tracks were gone. It was as if the entire thing had never happened. Over the next few days, I set up more cameras, checked the area constantly, and even spent a night in the clearing with my truck parked on the edge, lights on. Nothing unusual happened again. Weeks later, when I finally got a break, I drove into town and shared my experience with a fellow ranger who had worked the Bitterroot for decades. He listened, nodding slowly, and said something that stuck with me. "You're not imagining it. That area gets used by people who shouldn't be there. Poachers, hunters, sometimes worse. And they know the forest better than anyone. You'll see strange things, but if you keep your wits, you'll be fine." I spent the rest of the summer patrolling carefully, always alert, always ready. I never saw the fire again, but sometimes, when I drove down the forest roads at night, I felt that same presence, the same weight in the shadows, the knowledge that someone, or something, was out there, watching, pacing, moving in silence. When my assignment ended that September, I packed up, cleaned the guard station, and drove out. I left the Bitterroot behind, but I've never forgotten those nights. I learned that fear isn't about ghosts or monsters. It's about knowing there are real threats around you, invisible, skilled, patient. And surviving them depends entirely on paying attention, trusting your instincts, and respecting the power of the wilderness. I was 29 when I took the seasonal ranger job at the Sawtooth National Forest in central Idaho. It was the summer of 2016, and I was assigned to a small district near the headwaters of the Salmon River. The guard station was old, built in the 1950s, and sat on a rise overlooking a canyon. The nearest town was about 90 miles away, a little under 2 hours by the winding mountain roads. I had moved in alone. The only company I had would be the occasional hiker or hunter passing through. The cabin had no running water, and the solar panels on the roof were partially broken. I didn't realize it until my first week, but the batteries barely held a charge. That meant no reliable lights at night, no fan, and no real way to charge my phone except for the generator I had to run for an hour or so each day. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed in on you. The first few nights were rough. I hadn't slept properly in over a month due to a mix of stress, the isolation, and the bats that had taken up residence in the loft above the cabin. They were small, and I could hear them flitting around overhead at night, their tiny claws scratching across the beams. I couldn't kill them. They were protected, but I couldn't stop feeling like they were watching me. One evening, after a long day patrolling the trails and checking on a couple of hunters' camps, I was back at the cabin. I'd been out since dawn, hiking over rough terrain, checking for any illegal activity, making sure campsites weren't left unsafe. By the time I returned, the sun was just touching the tops of the pines. I started preparing dinner on the small propane stove when I heard a soft crunch on the deck outside. At first, I thought it was one of the deer that often wandered close to the cabin. But the sound was different, slow, deliberate, like someone pacing. I stepped out, flashlight in hand, scanning the edge of the tree line. Nothing. Just the tall pines swaying in the orange glow of the sunset. I told myself it was a raccoon or maybe a lost dog. I went back inside and tried to eat, but my nerves were on edge. The shadows seemed longer than usual, moving unnaturally across the walls. That night, sleep came fitfully, and I dreamt that the cabin was surrounded by figures moving just beyond the tree line. I woke sweating, thinking I heard the crunching again. A few days later, I decided to hike to a remote fire lookout I had been assigned to inspect. It was a long trek through thick forest and steep inclines, with barely a trail in some sections. By mid-afternoon, I had made it to the lookout, an old wooden tower perched on a ridge. I climbed up and started checking the equipment and supplies. Everything seemed fine. The view was incredible. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, but the isolation pressed down hard. When I started the hike back down, the sun was dipping behind the mountains and the shadows grew long and heavy. That's when I noticed it. Footprints. Large, deep, boot-like impressions in the soft dirt, leading off the trail and into the forest. They weren't fresh. The edges were soft from wind and dust, but they were too big to be mine. I followed them cautiously, scanning the trees. Nothing. No sign of movement, no animals fleeing, nothing. Still, the footprints continued deeper into the trees, perfectly spaced as if someone, or something, had walked this way purposefully. I realized I had lost track of the time. The sun had set, and darkness was beginning to swallow the forest. I tried to follow the trail back to the cabin, but the forest looked different in the dim light. Every tree seemed twisted, every shadow elongated. I kept my flashlight sweeping in wide arcs, listening for anything unusual. My heart was pounding. Then I heard it, the snap of a branch somewhere close by. I froze. The sound didn't come from above or below. It came from all around. I told myself it was probably a deer, a bear, or a coyote, but my gut told me otherwise. I started moving faster, almost running, and my flashlight beam caught movement in the corner of my eye. Something large, moving between the trunks, keeping pace. I didn't stop to look directly. I just ran. I tripped, fell, and scraped my hands and knees on rocks and roots, but I didn't care. I made it back to the cabin, slammed the door, and locked it. I sat against the wall, flashlight in hand, breathing hard. I stayed like that for hours, listening to the forest just outside. By midnight, everything had gone quiet again. Nothing. The next morning, I went outside to inspect the area around the cabin. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone or anything having been near. Just the usual animal tracks, deer, rabbits, raccoons, nothing more. It was as if the previous night had been some kind of hallucination, but I knew better. I had been careful, precise in my patrols, and I didn't hallucinate easily. From that day on, I doubled my precautions. I carried my radio at all times, kept my firearm within reach, and avoided hiking alone in the evening. I even rigged a small motion sensor near the cabin deck. Nothing ever tripped it. Still, every night, I could hear the subtle noises in the woods, the rustle of leaves, a distant snap of a branch, and I knew that something had passed through. Watching, waiting. By the end of the season, I had grown accustomed to the tension, and I had learned to read the forest differently. The experience didn't haunt me with ghosts or myths. It was the reality of being alone in a vast wilderness, knowing that you are small, exposed, and vulnerable. I left the cabin that September feeling more alive than I had in years, carrying a deep respect for the forest and an understanding that some dangers aren't supernatural. They are simply the raw, unpredictable nature of the wild, and your survival depends on caution, awareness, and respect. I never saw whatever had been out there again, but I always remembered the sound of the footsteps in the dark. And sometimes when I'm alone on a trail or sitting at a lookout, I can still feel the same chill, reminding me just how alone you truly are when the forest watches. I was 29, working as the lone recreation ranger in a small, remote district of northern Montana in the late summer of 2019. The guard station I had been assigned to sat at the end of a gravel road, almost 60 miles from the nearest town. The district was vast, dense with pine and fir forests, dotted with lakes that reflected the sky like mirrors. It was beautiful in a way that made your chest ache, but it also carried a heaviness that got under your skin, especially when you were alone for long stretches. I had moved into the guard station in early June. It was an old log cabin built in the 1960s, mostly functional, but showing its age and creaking floors and drafty windows. The solar panels on the roof weren't working properly, which meant that nights were cold and dark. I quickly learned that the batteries only held a charge for a few hours, so after sunset, the cabin became a cavern of shadows. I hadn't slept well in weeks. At first, it was just the usual irritations. Bats that had found their way into the rafters, the occasional raccoon scratching around outside. But soon I started noticing other things. At night I could hear footsteps on the deck. Not the random scurry of an animal, but deliberate, heavy steps. I'd wake up and check, flashlight in hand, shining into the dark woods, but nothing was ever there. The sound always stopped when I opened the door. Some nights I would hear soft whispers of movement deeper in the forest, like something large was shifting between the trees, and when I turned my head, I could just make out the glint of eyes reflecting the weak light of the moon. One evening in late August, I was out doing a routine patrol of the backcountry trail. The sun had already dipped behind the mountains, leaving the forest bathed in a dull twilight. My truck's headlights barely pierced the thick shadows, and the gravel road wound so tightly between dense stands of pine that I could see almost nothing beyond 20 feet. I was driving slowly when I noticed tire tracks in the dirt. Fresh tracks, wide and deep, the kind that didn't belong to a car like mine. They led off the road into a side trail that I hadn't explored before. Curiosity mixed with caution. I parked the truck and took my flashlight, following the tracks on foot. They led me deeper into the forest, the smell of wet pine needles strong in the air. After 20 minutes, I realized the tracks weren't just human. They were mixed with something bigger, heavier, something that sank deeper into the soil. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was probably just a logging truck from weeks ago. Still, the forest was quiet in a way that made my skin crawl. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my boots and the faint, wet sound of something moving ahead. Then I saw it. At first I thought it was a fallen log, but the shape shifted, unnatural, like it was alive. It was huge, crouched low, its back slick and dark in the dim light. I froze. It didn't move aggressively, didn't charge. It just stared at me from a distance of 30 feet. Its eyes, bright, intelligent, and unnervingly calm, locked onto mine. My training kicked in, and I remembered what I'd been told in field manuals about wildlife encounters. Don't run, don't scream, slowly back away. I took a careful step backward, keeping my flashlight aimed. The thing didn't follow. Instead, it melted into the trees as quietly as it had appeared. My hands shook, but I forced myself to keep moving, marking the tracks with chalk from my pack, trying to follow them and make sense of what I'd seen. Eventually, the tracks ended at a small clearing with a shallow pit dug into the earth. I looked around and realized that whatever had been moving through the forest wasn't wild. It was human. The pit had signs of recent digging, and next to it lay a metal canister, half buried, covered in fresh soil. I didn't touch it. I called it in over the radio, careful to describe everything in detail. The dispatcher promised to alert the local sheriff, but I had to stay overnight. I returned to the guard station, every rustle outside making my nerves tighten. I barricaded the doors as best I could and checked the windows. The night passed slowly, the forest around me alive with the noises I had been learning to ignore. At dawn, I returned to the clearing with proper authorities. The sheriff and a deputy examined the pit and the tracks. It turned out to be a trap for poachers, cleverly disguised, and the creature I had seen crouched in the trees was an old bear with a missing paw, making its gait uneven and its posture strange in the dim light. After that, I spent a few weeks documenting illegal activity, patrolling the area more thoroughly, and installing extra motion-activated lights around the cabin. The experience taught me that fear can exaggerate shadows into monsters, and isolation can turn the ordinary into the terrifying. But it also reminded me why I loved this job. I was the only one keeping the forest. The wildlife and visitors safe, and I had the skills to do it, even when my imagination tried to convince me otherwise. By the end of September, the solar panels were repaired, and I finally slept a full night for the first time in months. The forest was still vast and quiet, sometimes eerie, but I had learned how to respect it without letting it control me. I left that post at the end of the season with a new sense of confidence. What had scared me most was not the forest or the bear, or even the poachers, but the idea of being utterly alone with my mind. And once I faced that, everything else became manageable. I was the only ranger assigned to a small, remote district in Central Oregon, just outside the Ochoco National Forest. in the summer of 2018. I was 29 at the time, recently promoted to full-time after years of seasonal work, and this assignment was supposed to be a dream come true. The station itself was a tiny, weathered cabin set on the edge of a ridge, overlooking thick pine forests that rolled for miles. It was isolated, the nearest town more than 2 hours away on winding dirt roads that became nearly impassable after heavy rain. The first week was rough. The cabin ran on solar power, but the system had clearly been neglected for years. Batteries barely held a charge, and the inverter kept tripping. I ended up relying on a mix of a small generator and lanterns, which made nighttime feel more oppressive than it should have. The air inside was dry and dusty, and I kept finding bat droppings in corners and on the kitchen table. I hadn't had a full night's sleep in over a month, partly because the solar lights kept flickering, partly because every night something seemed to walk on the deck outside. I would lie in bed, straining to hear, listening to the low thud of boots, or maybe paws, moving back and forth, sometimes stopping, sometimes pacing, just beyond the thin cabin walls. The forest itself was quiet, but in a way that made your skin crawl. It wasn't the normal quiet of nature. It was the kind of quiet that seemed to listen back. I would drive the patrol truck along the winding gravel roads during the day, checking for illegal campers or off-roaders. But even in sunlight, the trees seemed to lean in closer than they should, shadows stretching unnaturally across the dirt. I felt it the most when hiking alone to check trailheads or remote signs. Every now and then, I would catch movement from the corner of my eye, something large moving in the undergrowth. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. One evening, I had a long day marking old fire lines for maintenance. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun had dipped behind the ridge, leaving everything in shades of gray and deep blue. I cooked a simple dinner and sat on the porch, sipping lukewarm coffee, staring at the forest. That's when I noticed it. A figure, or what I first thought was a figure, standing at the edge of the tree line, completely still, watching me. My first instinct was that it was a hunter, maybe someone trespassing, but there was no movement, no rifle glint, nothing that looked human close up. It was just there. I squinted, but when I reached for binoculars, it had vanished. I checked all around with my flashlight, even drove the truck up the nearby service road, but the area was empty. The next night it got worse. I had finally managed to patch together a working solar setup, so the cabin lights were on most of the evening. I was on the porch, checking the radio, when I heard a low growl from somewhere downhill. It wasn't like a coyote or a wolf. It was deep and resonant, vibrating through the ground under my feet. I grabbed my flashlight and tried to pinpoint it, but the sound moved, like it was circling me. My dog, a rescue mutt named Hobo, who had come with me to the station, barked once and ran to the cabin, tail tucked. That's when I realized I hadn't seen any tracks near the cabin before. But now faint depressions in the dirt suggested something massive had been moving around the cabin all day, hidden by the trees. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the cabin, every crack from the forest, made my heart race. On the fifth night, I decided I needed to patrol further out. I packed my flashlight, bear spray, rifle, and hobo, and drove along the back roads. Around midnight, I parked near a small creek crossing and got out to check an old trail. That's when I saw it. Huge paw-like prints pressed into the damp mud, at least twice the size of a human hand. They were fresh, leading from the creek and into the denser forest. I followed them cautiously, flashlight sweeping ahead. The trail twisted and turned, sometimes splitting, but I could feel that whatever made them was close. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, just behind a fallen log. I froze. I could smell it before I saw it, wet fur, musk, and something metallic, like blood. Hobo growled softly at my side. I raised the rifle, heart pounding, scanning the shadows. Nothing moved. I waited. The growl came again, closer, followed by the soft rustle of heavy movement through the underbrush. Then it stopped. Complete silence. My pulse slowed slightly, but I knew one thing. Whatever it wasn't interested in attacking me. Not yet. By dawn, the prince stopped abruptly at the edge of a ravine. There were no signs of the creature leaving, no broken branches, no tracks down the slope, nothing. It was as if it had just vanished. I returned to the cabin, exhausted, and spent the rest of the morning documenting everything. Later that day, I hiked around the area again and found remnants of a large deer carcass partially buried in brush, old and scavenged, suggesting a large predator had been feeding nearby. I realized then that I hadn't been hallucinating. The area was home to a massive black bear, or possibly a rogue grizzly, a species not supposed to be in that section of the forest anymore. The weeks that followed, I adjusted my patrols. I set up cameras, kept Hobo close at all times, and made sure the cabin was secured. The sightings stopped after a while, and the prints became rare. I learned to respect the presence in the woods, and in turn, it seemed to respect me. I never saw it close again, but I felt it whenever I patrolled. That summer ended without injury, but I left with a new understanding of isolation and the reality of living alongside nature at its most raw. By the end of my assignment, I was exhausted, but also proud. I had survived nights where fear gripped me like a living thing, and I had learned to read the forest in ways no book could teach. I left the cabin locked and the trails marked, knowing the woods were still wild, and sometimes, just sometimes, they were watching. I had been working as the lone park ranger for a small district in northern Montana since the spring of 2014. I was 26, freshly out of the ranger training program, and this post was supposed to be a quiet, low-stress assignment. The district itself was tucked deep in the Bitterroot Mountains, a vast, rugged area with towering pines, narrow creeks, and endless stretches of trails. The nearest town was over 2 hours away by car, and the guard station I lived in was a modest, weathered cabin perched on the edge of a ridge, with a view of the valley below. The first week was rough, mostly because I quickly realized the solar panels powering the cabin weren't working properly. That meant I had no lights after sunset and no functioning radio. I'd been living off a battery-powered lantern and a small camping stove. Nights were long and silent, except for the wind rattling the loose boards on the deck and the occasional flurry of small animals passing through the underbrush. I barely slept. The isolation gnawed at me, and the constant tension made my body tense, like I was waiting for something that didn't exist. One evening in late May, I was on a routine patrol, walking a stretch of trail that followed the edge of a steep slope. The sun had just dipped behind the mountains, leaving the forest in an almost oppressive darkness. My flashlight caught glimpses of glistening streams and the shadows of gnarled trees, but it also revealed something else. The faint, deep impressions of footprints pressed into the soft soil. I crouched down to inspect them. They were large, humanoid, but the toes were elongated, almost exaggerated. My first thought was that it had to be a hunter or someone passing through, but the prints were too fresh and too large for anyone I knew in the area. I took photographs with my phone, keeping a mental note to check them against known patterns of wildlife. By the next night, my sleep deprivation was catching up with me. I hadn't slept properly in over 3 weeks, surviving mostly on quick naps and strong black coffee. The wind had picked up, rattling the cabin and causing the trees outside to creak like they were whispering. Around 2 a.m., I awoke to the sound of footsteps on the deck. My first instinct was fear. Someone had broken in. I grabbed my flashlight, careful not to make a sound, and crept to the window. Outside, I could see nothing, but the snow-white moonlight revealed the faint outline of something crouched near the edge of the tree line. Its shape was vague, but the posture was unmistakably deliberate. It didn't run. It didn't move erratically. It simply waited, as though it knew I was watching. I spent the rest of that night wide awake, checking every corner of the cabin, inspecting locks, even preparing my small hunting rifle. By morning, I was exhausted, but I didn't tell anyone in town. There was no real reason to. The nearest authorities were 2 hours away, and I couldn't explain what I had seen without sounding insane. Over the next few days, the incidents escalated. Footprints appeared on the trails I knew I had patrolled thoroughly. Items from my cabin, things like a hatchet and a water bottle, were moved or missing. One morning, I found a series of scratches on the deck railing, deep gouges that hadn't been there before. I began keeping a small journal, noting times, locations, and conditions, trying to find a pattern. It was meticulous work, and it occupied my mind enough to keep the fear from becoming completely overwhelming. One night I decided to set up a motion-activated camera outside the cabin. I positioned it to cover the tree line and the approach to the deck. I left it running, returning the next morning to check the footage. What I saw froze me in place. A figure, impossibly tall and broad, moved silently through the trees. It didn't run. It didn't make noise. It seemed almost careful. But there was no question. It was watching the cabin, and it lingered long enough to leave clear impressions of its size and gait. Then it vanished back into the darkness, leaving nothing but broken branches and the faint outline of footprints. I realized then that I had two choices: abandon the post, leaving months of work behind, or prepare for what was coming. I opted for the latter. Over the next week, I reinforced the cabin as best I could, installing makeshift locks and barriers, creating an improvised alarm system with cans and strings around the perimeter. I also made sure to carry my rifle everywhere, keeping it close at night. It was the following Thursday when it reached its peak. I had been out on a midday inspection of a remote creek when I noticed the tracks converging from multiple directions. They led to a small clearing, and in the middle was a crude, almost animal-like arrangement of branches and rocks. I didn't touch it. I simply observed and took photos. Then I saw the figure emerge from the trees. This time it walked directly toward me, slow but deliberate. My heart pounded as I raised my rifle. It stopped 50 feet away, turned slightly, and for the first time I noticed the intelligence in its posture. Every movement measured, cautious. I held my breath, ready to fire if necessary. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it retreated back into the forest. After that day, I never saw the figure again. The footprints disappeared, the scratches ceased, and my cabin returned to a tense but manageable quiet. I never learned exactly what had been watching me. Some nights I'd hear distant branches breaking, or see fleeting shadows in the corner of my eyes, but it never approached again. I stayed at that post until the end of my contract, and I learned a valuable lesson. The wilderness is full of mysteries that don't require ghosts to scare you. Sometimes the real terror is knowing something is out there, intelligent, patient, and observing you, and knowing there's nothing you can do to control it. By the time I left Montana, I was exhausted, hardened, and more cautious than I had ever been. I didn't tell many people about that final spring in the Bitterroots, but I never doubted what I had experienced. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't imagined. It was simply raw, unpredictable wilderness, reminding me that no matter how trained or prepared you are, the forest always has the upper hand. I was 28 when I took the position as the sole recreation ranger for a remote district in northern Montana, somewhere deep in the Bob Marshall wilderness. The nearest town, a tiny place called Sula, was almost 2 hours away by car, down winding dirt roads that seemed to vanish into the forest. I had just moved into the old Ranger Guard station, a small weathered cabin perched on the edge of a clearing. The cabin was built sometime in the 1960s, and had the kind of charm that only comes from peeling paint, creaking floors, and a smell of damp wood that lingers no matter how many times you clean. I thought it would be an adventure. I was wrong. The first week was rough. The solar panels weren't working properly, so I had no real electricity except what I could scrounge from a small generator. The nights were long and pitch black, and I had trouble sleeping. There were bats in the attic that liked to wake me around 3 in the morning, fluttering around my head. Sometimes I could hear something heavy walking across the deck outside, slow and deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was deer, maybe a bear, but there was a rhythm to it that felt different, like it was pacing. Days were no easier. I spent hours hiking through dense forest, checking trails, monitoring streams, and clearing fallen logs. The woods themselves felt off, not in a supernatural way, but in a way that made me tense without realizing it. There were no clearings, just endless tall pines and thick underbrush. The wind would sometimes die completely, and all the sounds would vanish, leaving a suffocating silence that pressed in from all sides. You could hear your own heartbeat. It was about the third week when it really started to get to me. I had been awake for almost 30 days straight. I wasn't sleeping because I kept hearing things at night and the generator only worked in short bursts. My body was exhausted, my mind frayed. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Branches moving when there was no wind, shadows where there shouldn't be any. I knew better than to imagine ghosts, but it was impossible not to feel watched. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of someone, or something, breathing outside the cabin. I froze. My flashlight was on the small table beside me, but I didn't want to move. The breathing was slow, steady, and close. I could hear the crunch of boots or maybe paws on the gravel path leading up to the cabin. I grabbed my rifle, careful not to make a sound, and slowly approached the window. Outside, the clearing was dark, almost total darkness, but I could see a figure crouched near the edge of the tree line. At first I thought it was a person, maybe a hiker lost or someone looking to cause trouble. I sat in the darkness, holding my breath, trying to get my bearings. The figure didn't move for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a minute or two. Then it started moving back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. I waited until I was sure it was gone, then cautiously stepped outside. The gravel was undisturbed, except for deep footprints leading away from the cabin, too large to be human, and spaced too far apart for a regular stride. My stomach dropped. A bear? Maybe. But bears don't walk on two legs. I had never seen tracks like these. I spent the next day in a nervous fog, checking the perimeter of the cabin, examining the woods, listening to every sound. I didn't see anything again that day, and by evening, I convinced myself it must have been some trick of the dark, a combination of exhaustion and stress. I set up a few trail cameras along the most likely paths the creature might take, just to be safe. The next night, around midnight, I heard it again, heavy breathing, slow steps, coming from the far side of the clearing. This time I wasn't frozen. I grabbed a flashlight and my rifle and crept outside. I scanned the clearing with the beam. For a few terrifying seconds, I saw two eyes reflecting the light, just at the edge of the tree line. The thing didn't run. I just watched. I aimed my rifle, heart hammering, but didn't fire. Bears can be unpredictable, and shooting one without backup could be dangerous. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the creature turned and vanished into the trees. The beam of my flashlight caught a large black bear as it scrambled into the shadows, impossibly silent for its size. Relief washed over me, mixed with a lingering fear. That was it, what I had been hearing all along. My mind had turned normal animal behavior into something sinister because I was exhausted, alone, and trapped in that oppressive wilderness. After that night, I took precautions. I reinforced the cabin, made sure I had plenty of food, and forced myself to sleep during the day when the bears were less active. I eventually got the solar panels working, installed motion lights, and kept my rifle close. The fear never fully went away, but understanding it was just a bear, nothing more, made it manageable. By the end of the month, I had adjusted to the solitude and the danger. I realized that the wilderness wasn't evil. It was indifferent. It didn't try to scare you or haunt you. It just existed, and the animals within it had their own lives and territories. I was just an intruder trying to do my job. The experience left me tense, hyper-aware, and deeply respectful of the forest, but alive, and in a strange way, grateful. I had faced the unknown and survived, not because I was brave or clever, but because I stayed alert, cautious, and respectful of the environment around me. Sometimes, even now, when I think back to that first month in the Bob Marshall wilderness, I can still hear the crunch of those enormous paws on the gravel, the steady breathing in the dark, and the cold weight of isolation. But I also remember the lessons I learned. Patience, awareness, and the simple truth that fear often has a very real, very explainable source. That understanding made the wilderness feel less threatening and more like a place where I could exist, carefully and safely, for as long as I needed to. I was a park ranger in the summer of 2014, stationed in a remote section of the Bitterroot National Forest in western Montana. I was 28 at the time, and this was my first solo posting after working as an assistant ranger for a few years. The district I was assigned to was massive but sparsely patrolled. The nearest town was about 2 hours away, and the ranger station itself was a small, aging cabin with no running water and only a tiny solar setup that powered a single light in the main room. For weeks before I arrived, the solar panels hadn't been producing enough power to charge my radio fully, which already had me uneasy. The first few nights were rough. The cabin was old, made of dark wood that creaked with every gust of wind, and the floors would settle in ways that sounded like footsteps. I didn't mind wildlife noises. Bears and coyotes were normal, but the deeper I went into the forest, the more the noises felt deliberate, as if the trees themselves were watching. Sleep came hard, and when it did, it was fitful, broken by snaps, rustles, and the occasional thump on the roof that made me sit bolt upright. At first I blamed the wind or animals, but after a week of it, I realized nothing I could see explained the sounds. One evening in late August, I was checking a section of the trail near a small creek that ran through a narrow canyon. It was a place campers rarely reached, a dead-end trail that only led to a steep rock face and a series of natural springs. The day had been hot, the kind of dry heat that makes the forest smell like pine resin mixed with dust. I had hiked in about 3 miles, following the trail markers carefully, when I noticed something off. The trail looked like it had been walked recently, footprints in the soft soil, but they were too large and irregular to be mine, and too fresh to be from hikers passing earlier that day. I paused, scanning the trees around me. The forest was quiet in a way that made my skin crawl, the kind of quiet where birds stop calling and even the wind dies down. My heart rate went up, but I told myself it was probably just someone hiking off trail. I took out my notebook to mark the coordinates and check the trail conditions, but then I heard it, a faint snapping of twigs behind me. I froze. The sound was slow, deliberate, moving through the underbrush. I didn't move. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my training kept me calm. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam through the trees. Nothing, just shadows. But the sound came again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't moving like an animal. Animals don't step cautiously like humans do. I started to backtrack slowly, keeping my flashlight ahead. Then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the trail. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it was tall, wearing dark clothing, blending almost perfectly with the trees. I stopped, not daring to breathe too loudly. The figure didn't move, and neither did I. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. I reached for my radio, but the battery was low. Only a small, faint chirp came out. I whispered into it, calling my station, but I knew it was a long shot. The figure took a step toward the trail, and my training finally kicked in. I turned sharply and ran, following the trail back toward the cabin, not looking back until I reached the edge of the creek. My legs were burning, my lungs tight, but the sound of the figure pursuing me never came. I could only hear the rush of the water and my own breath. I stayed in the cabin that night, securing every door and window. I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner with my flashlight and my rifle, listening. Every rustle outside made me jump. I realized later that whoever, or whatever, had been there probably hadn't followed me back. They were patient, maybe watching, waiting for another chance. The next morning, I hiked the trail again in daylight, looking for footprints or signs of a person camping nearby. There were none, only the broken branches and the disturbed soil where I had felt the presence the night before. It was as if the figure had vanished into the forest entirely. I marked the trail as potentially unsafe in my notes and sent a message to my supervisor in the nearest town. They didn't think anyone would be out there, but they agreed to put a patrol through the area the next day. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal. I patrolled the district, repaired the cabins, checked on campers, and maintained the trails. The memory of that night never left me, though. Every so often, when I was alone, I would think about that figure standing at the edge of the trail, silent and patient. I never saw it again. I learned to trust my instincts more, to take the isolation seriously, and to always have a backup plan when hiking in the remote parts of the forest. By the end of my posting, I had gained a lot of respect for the wilderness, but also for the fact that people sometimes venture into places they shouldn't. That summer taught me the most important lesson of being a ranger. The forest is full of quiet dangers, not all of them natural. Some are human, and sometimes the most terrifying part isn't what you see, but knowing that someone, or something, can watch you for hours without making a sound and disappear before you can even prove it existed. I was 28 when I got my first solo assignment as a park ranger in a small remote district of central Idaho. The station was at the edge of the Frank Church Wilderness, nearly 20 miles from the nearest town, and accessible only by a rough dirt road that became nearly impassable after a heavy rain. When I arrived in early May, the snow from the winter had only just started to melt in patches along the higher ridges, and the air smelled like wet pine and cold earth. The station itself was a small, two-room cabin with a wood stove, solar, panels on the roof, and a deck that looked over a steep slope into dense forest. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the kind of quiet you get in a city at night, but the kind of silence that presses on your ears and your chest. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. My first week was spent unpacking supplies, checking the water tanks, and trying to get the solar panels functioning. They never did. Every evening I ended up sitting in near darkness, using only a small propane lantern, listening to the wind through the trees and the occasional crack of a distant branch. I was already sleep-deprived when the odd things started happening. The first night, I thought it was just my imagination. I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of footsteps on the deck. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the deck creaked in a way that felt human. I stayed frozen in my bed, straining to listen. The sound stopped after a few minutes, but I couldn't sleep again that night. By the third week, my body was running on fumes. The constant darkness, the cold nights, the near total isolation, it was breaking me down. Then, one morning, I found something that really unsettled me. I had gone out to check the perimeter around the cabin, making sure the trail cameras were still functioning. In the snow near the base of the deck, I saw footprints that weren't mine. They were large, heavy, and perfectly formed, leading straight from the woods to the cabin and back again. I followed them, trying to convince myself they belonged to a hiker or a hunter. But the nearest trailhead was miles away, and no one had reported being in the area. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the corner with my flashlight, listening, waiting. The next few days were a blur of work, exhaustion, and unease. Every sound in the forest felt amplified. A snapping branch could mean a falling tree, or something else. At times, I could swear I caught glimpses of movement just beyond the tree line. Shadows that shouldn't be there. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I had responsibilities. The park was under a fire risk, and I had to monitor the area, check wildlife activity, and make sure the trails were safe for the summer visitors that would eventually arrive. One night during a storm, I was sitting in the cabin when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and steady, pacing back and forth on the deck. The wind was howling, rain slamming against the windows, and the trees were bending like they were about to snap. I grabbed my rifle, telling myself I needed to investigate. As I stepped onto the porch, water dripping from my jacket, I realized the footprints in the mud were fresh. Not just my imagination, someone, or something, had been walking here in the dark. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight. Nothing moved. My stomach sank. Whoever it was had disappeared, leaving only their tracks. The breaking point came on a cold morning when I was inspecting a bridge over a creek. As I walked along the trail, I noticed something unusual. The rope I used to secure my pack the night before had been cut. I had tied it myself. No one else had been near it. My pulse was racing. I packed up and headed back to the cabin, moving as quickly as I could without making noise. When I reached the cabin, I found that one of the windows was slightly open. Not just cracked, it had been forced. That's when I realized I wasn't just tired or imagining things. Someone had been watching me for weeks, moving silently through the forest, studying my routines. The fear that had been gnawing at me turned into something sharper, more immediate. I made a decision. I wouldn't wait for them to come again. I packed my essentials, left a detailed note for my supervisor, and started the long drive back to town. The dirt road was slick with mud, and the truck bounced over rocks and ruts. But I didn't stop until I reached the highway. When I finally called in, I explained everything. The tracks, the broken rope, the forced window. The supervisors didn't dismiss me, but they were calm, clinical. They said it wasn't unheard of. Remote cabins sometimes attract poachers, trespassers, or people looking to hide out. They sent a ranger team to inspect the cabin, and I returned a week later with them. They found evidence that someone had been living in the forest near the cabin for months. Makeshift shelters, remnants of campfires, even stolen supplies from my station. But no one was ever caught. The experience stayed with me, of course. The isolation, the sound of footsteps on the deck in the middle of the night, the feeling of being watched. It changed the way I saw the job. I learned to trust my instincts, to always lock windows, to carry extra gear, and never underestimate the people who might be hiding in the woods. I went back to being a ranger, but I never stayed alone in a remote cabin again. Sometimes, when I drive past that area now, I look at the ridges and the forests and think about the person, or people, who had been there before me. It's easy to romanticize the wilderness, but out there, in the quiet, in the shadows, danger doesn't have to be supernatural to be real. It just has to be human. I had just started my first solo season as a recreation ranger in the Salmon Chalice National Forest in Idaho in 2017. I was 26, fresh out of seasonal work at a larger park in Montana and eager to prove myself. The district I was assigned to was small, remote, and mostly empty. My guard station sat on a ridge with nothing around for miles. A 100-year-old wooden cabin barely held together by rotting boards and a sagging roof. The nearest town was over an hour and a half away by dirt road, and in the winter months, even that could be cut off entirely by snow or washouts. The first few weeks were rough. The cabin's solar panels didn't work properly, leaving me without reliable electricity. The nights were long and cold, and the area was alive with strange sounds that carried across the forest. At first it was small things, branches snapping, birds squawking in the night, the occasional coyote howl. But slowly it escalated into something that made my skin crawl. Something was moving around the cabin after dark. I didn't see it directly, not at first, but I would hear footsteps on the deck, slow and deliberate, or the faint rustle of leaves close enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it. I hadn't slept properly in weeks. My eyes burned constantly, and the cabin felt like a pressure cooker of tension. There were bats living in the loft above the ceiling, their squeaks echoing through the thin walls. I'd catch glimpses of them flitting around at night when I turned on my small lantern. I tried not to think about the forest itself, which pressed in around the cabin. The trees were unnaturally thick and twisted, with shadowed pockets between them where the sunlight didn't reach. On clear days it looked peaceful, almost beautiful, but at night it was different. It was alive, and it felt like it was watching me. One evening I was out doing a routine patrol, walking along one of the fire roads that cut through the district. I had my flashlight and my ranger vest, and I was checking for illegal campers or signs of poaching. The air was crisp, the sky fading to dark purple as the sun set behind the mountains. I heard the sound first, a distant but unmistakable shout, sharp and panicked. It wasn't human yelling as much as it was someone screaming for help, broken, high-pitched, and desperate. I froze. I knew the area. There shouldn't have been anyone there. The nearest campers were a good 15 miles away. I grabbed my radio to call in, but the signal was weak, fading in and out. So I decided I had no choice but to investigate myself. I followed the sound carefully, keeping to the fire road, but shining my light into the thick brush alongside. Every few seconds I would hear something move, branches snapping, leaves crunching, but I couldn't see anything. My pulse was pounding in my ears and I forced myself to stay calm, repeating in my head that I was trained for this. After about 20 minutes, I found the source. A man was lying on the ground in a small clearing, not far from the edge of a creek. He was bleeding from a gash on his leg and clearly in shock. I recognized him from the Ranger Patrol notes. He had been hiking solo, heading to a remote fishing spot. He had slipped on the moss-covered rocks along the creek bank and fallen hard, breaking his ankle. He was alone, scared, and unable to move. I assessed him quickly. He was conscious, which was good, but he needed help. I applied my first aid kit to the wound, making a temporary splint from a branch and some rope I carried. The man was shivering and pale, but he was able to mumble his thanks. The problem was getting him out. The terrain was steep, the creek muddy, and night was falling fast. There was no way to carry him all the way to the road by myself. I decided on a plan. Get him to the nearest point where a four-wheel drive vehicle could reach and call for backup. I fashioned a makeshift stretcher using branches and my tarp, and we slowly made our way through the brush. Every step was a challenge. The ground was slick from recent rains, and I had to navigate steep slopes with him on the stretcher. My hands were cut and bleeding from branches and thorns, and my boots were soaked through. But the most unsettling part was the silence around us. No owls, no rustling, nothing except the occasional crack of a branch under our feet. It was as if the forest itself had stopped breathing. Finally, after what felt like hours, we made it to a small clearing where my truck could reach. I called for the park rescue team, who were able to come and transport the man safely. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was past midnight. I was exhausted, soaked, and sore, but I felt a strange relief. The night felt calmer, quieter, as if the tension that had been pressing on me for weeks had finally lifted. Over the next few days, I made some changes to the cabin. I reinforced the deck, set up motion-sensitive lights, and patched up the gaps where animals, or worse, could enter. I still heard the forest at night, but it no longer felt threatening. It felt like it had simply been waiting, as if testing my ability to handle the isolation. I realized that being a ranger wasn't about fearlessness. It was about preparedness, patience, and the willingness to act even when every instinct told you to freeze. That season taught me more than any training manual could. I learned how fragile human life is in the backcountry, how dangerous even an ordinary hike can become, and how important it is to trust your skills and your instincts. Most of all, I learned that fear is a tool. It keeps you alert, keeps you alive, and reminds you that you are responsible not just for yourself, but for anyone who wanders into the wilds you've sworn to protect. By the end of that year, I had gained a new respect for the forest and for the role of a ranger. The forest was still eerie, still intimidating at night, but it no longer held the same oppressive weight. I had faced it and survived, and in doing so, I had grown in ways I never expected. That first season had been terrifying, exhausting, and lonely. But it had also made me stronger, more capable, and more certain that I could handle whatever the wilderness might throw at me. I was 26, working my first solo season as the recreation ranger for a small district in the northern reaches of Montana. The district was one of the least trafficked in the state, with a few hiking trails and primitive campsites scattered across nearly 100 square miles of dense forest. The nearest town was over 2 hours away, and cell service was nearly non-existent. I had taken the job knowing it would be lonely, but the solitude had a different edge than I expected. I moved into the ranger station at the beginning of June. The building was old, built in the 1960s, with peeling green paint and a sagging porch that creaked under the slightest weight. The station had basic solar panels for power, but when I arrived, none of them seemed to work properly. The fridge barely held a cold temperature, and the lights flickered whenever the sun went behind a cloud. I had brought a generator, but it was loud and temperamental. Nights were long, and sleep came in fragments. The first week, I noticed small things: a scratch on the kitchen window frame, footprints in the dirt outside the cabin door. At first, I thought it was deer, or maybe raccoons, but the footprints were too large, and the shape was wrong. My mind tried to rationalize everything. The forest was full of wildlife. Coyotes traveled in packs. Bears wandered freely. But still, every time I stepped outside at night, I felt eyes watching me. On the seventh night, I woke up to a sound on the porch. It was heavy, deliberate. My cabin sat on a slight rise, and the deck overlooked a small clearing surrounded by pines. I had thought I was alone, but whatever was out there was big enough to make the wooden deck groan. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it outside. The beam cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing. Still, the snow, well, it wasn't snow. It was June, dry dirt, had tiny scuff marks in it, moving away from the cabin toward the woods. No animal I knew walked like that. Sleep became impossible. I rationed coffee like water in a desert, pacing the cabin, listening for every sound. I took daily hikes, partly to patrol the area, partly to calm my nerves. The forest was dense, the trees tall and straight, their trunks thick with moss. Streams ran like silver ribbons, and the air smelled of pine and wet earth. But there was a constant tension, an underlying pressure. The woods seemed to hold their breath whenever I passed. Around the third week, the feeling escalated. One evening, while I was checking the trail near an old logging road, I saw a figure, or at least the shape of something tall, standing perfectly still between the trees. My heart jumped. I raised my binoculars, trying to make out what it was. Nothing. Just darkness and shadows. When I blinked, it was gone. My rational mind screamed it was a deer, a tree stump, maybe a trick of the fading light. But the size was all wrong, and its stillness was unnatural. I finished my patrol quickly, keeping my back to the tree line whenever I could. The final incident happened on the 28th day. I had been awake for nearly 30 hours, trying to fix the solar panels in the fading light, my muscles trembling with exhaustion. That night I dozed for a few minutes in the living room, my head against the window. I woke to the sound of heavy breathing, outside the cabin, just past the deck railing. I froze. My flashlight was too far across the room. My mind raced. The sound wasn't mechanical or animalistic. It was low, wet, and deliberate. I grabbed a hunting rifle I had for emergencies. The air was cold, unusually cold for June. I opened the door slowly, stepping onto the porch. Moonlight filtered through the trees, silvering the forest floor. Nothing moved. The deck was empty, but I noticed large footprints in the dirt, pressed deep into the soil. They led straight toward the forest, and then, at the edge of the clearing, they disappeared. I spent hours scanning the tree line with the flashlight, my finger on the trigger, my muscles tensed and trembling. Nothing emerged. No rustling, no snapping branches. I realized then how alone I truly was. The forest was vast, silent, and impenetrable. Whatever had been there could still be watching, and there was nothing I could do about it. By the next morning, I made a decision. I packed the essentials, filled the truck with gas, and drove the 2 hours back to town. The ranger station was still mine, but I didn't sleep there again that season. I reported the footprints and sounds to the park supervisor. They checked the area but found no evidence, just the usual wildlife signs. Deer, bears, coyote scat. No footprints, no nests, no strange markings. In hindsight, I think what I experienced was part exhaustion, part heightened senses. The mind reacts strangely in isolation, especially when you're constantly alert. But even now, years later, I remember the size of those footprints, the way the air felt heavy, how the woods seemed to bend and wait. I still hike in Montana sometimes, but I never take a job in an isolated station again. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods at night, I can feel it again, the pressure, the stillness, the eyes that seem to follow without moving. But I also know how I survived it, by staying alert, trusting my instincts, and most importantly, leaving before exhaustion left me helpless. That's the lesson I carry. The forest isn't haunted. It's indifferent, but it doesn't forgive mistakes, and it doesn't care if you're afraid. I was 28, fresh out of the academy, and had just landed my first solo posting as a park ranger in the northern wilderness of Montana in the summer of 2019. The district I was assigned to was remote, almost absurdly so. My station was a small, weathered cabin tucked along the edge of a canyon, perched above the river that cut through the valley like a scar. The nearest town was 2 hours away by dirt road, which itself turned into mud with any rain, and phone service was spotty at best. This was the kind of place where you could disappear into the trees and not be heard from for days. It was the kind of place I thought I could handle. I was wrong. The first week was rough. The cabin was powered entirely by solar panels, but the previous rangers had warned me they barely kept the lights on after a week of cloudy skies. Sure enough, the first morning I woke up, the panels hadn't charged properly overnight, and the tiny fridge had started humming ominously. I felt the weight of isolation immediately. My first few days were spent patrolling the usual trails, checking for illegal hunting, and inspecting bridges and signage. I was meticulous, writing reports, noting erosion patterns, and keeping the small visitor logs up to date. The woods were beautiful, tall pines, thick underbrush, and the smell of wet earth. But there was something about the air that felt off. It was heavy, like the trees themselves were pressing down on you, and the silence was absolute, except for the occasional distant rumble of the river. Sleep was impossible. The first night, I kept hearing scratching on the deck outside. I thought it was raccoons, or maybe squirrels, but the noises were too heavy, deliberate. I would lie awake, flashlight in hand, scanning the deck boards for movement, but the moonlight revealed nothing. Then came the footsteps. Slow, measured, pacing around the perimeter of the cabin. I told myself it was my imagination. The third night, I started noticing subtle signs of someone or something moving around outside. Branches snapped just beyond the tree line. Footprints in the soft mud near the cabin. Small stones shifted in places I hadn't left them. By the second week, exhaustion was clawing at me. My back ached, my eyes burned, and my hands shook from lack of sleep. I tried staying busy, patrolling the canyon rim during the day, checking old logging roads, inspecting stream crossings for erosion, but the nights were the worst. One night I heard a rustling that was distinctly human. It wasn't the soft shuffle of deer or the crack of a bear in the brush. It was deliberate, like someone was moving slowly but carefully through the underbrush. I grabbed my rifle, not out of paranoia, but because survival instincts were screaming at me. I checked the perimeter with my flashlight, sweeping the trees and the riverbank, but found nothing. Just shadows and the occasional glint of river water in the moonlight. Then came the scent. I can't describe it exactly. It was metallic, sour, and thick in the air, like wet iron in decay. It made my stomach twist. I followed it cautiously toward the riverbank, rifle raised, and saw tracks. Human footprints, fresh, leading down the slope to the water. Whoever had been there hadn't left anything else behind. No trash, no gear, just the prints. My heart was hammering, and I realized I was completely alone. For a week I had been hearing these steps, following them in my head at every creak of the floorboards, and now I had proof. For the next few days, I took extreme precautions. I locked the cabin from the inside, secured every window with screws and planks I found in the shed, and kept my rifle at the ready at night. The strange noises didn't stop. Sometimes I'd hear someone walking along the ridge above the cabin, footsteps crunching gravel, stopping, then moving again. One morning, I went out to inspect the back deck, and there was a mark carved into the wood railing, a deep slash. Like someone had tried to carve initials, but the edges were rough, ragged, and old enough to have been there for at least a few days. My hands shook as I photographed it, noting every detail from my report. Then, one evening, after a long patrol along a canyon trail, I returned to find the back door of the cabin ajar. I had locked it that morning. Nothing was missing, but the lock had been forced just enough to turn. My stomach turned icy, and I called the ranger station in the nearest town. They told me they'd send someone up the next day, but I knew that was hours away. I stayed inside, flashlight sweeping the cabin, listening. Every sound outside made my heart race. An owl hoot, the creak of a tree limb, the river hitting rocks. That night, I sat in the corner of the cabin with my rifle across my lap, eyes barely open until dawn finally crept over the canyon. Exhaustion overtook fear briefly, and I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke, the first thing I did was inspect the perimeter. The tracks were gone. Nothing was disturbed outside except for some broken branches, probably from wind. For the first time in days, the woods felt empty. Later that afternoon, the backup ranger arrived. Together, we patrolled the trails, checked the cabin, and documented the strange marks. He told me I wasn't crazy. He'd seen it before in this district. People trespassing, poachers, even squatters hiding out. The solitude of the place made them bold. Over the next few days, more rangers rotated through, and we installed proper locks, trail cameras, and motion sensor lights. The isolation remained, but I learned to manage it, and the footsteps outside never returned. Looking back, I realized that the scariest part wasn't a shadowy figure or some supernatural presence. It was the isolation, the knowledge that someone could be there, watching, and I'd have no help if things went wrong. It taught me to respect the wilderness, not just for its beauty, but for its danger, the vulnerability it imposes, and the discipline required to survive and protect it. By the end of that season, I had built my routine. I could patrol the trails, check on campers, and inspect the river crossings without fear paralyzing me. The noises at night faded into the background, nothing more than wind in the pines, small animals rustling in the brush. I left that posting with a new understanding. Fear is real, but preparation, vigilance, and experience transform fear into control. I was scared, yes, but I survived. And that survival was all the proof I needed that I could handle the wilderness, no matter how isolated or eerie it felt. I started my seasonal position as a recreation ranger in the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana in the summer of 2014. I was 24 at the time, fresh out of college, and desperate to escape the city for a while. The nearest town from my guard station was Florence, a tiny place with a gas station and a diner, about an hour-and-a-half drive away on winding forest roads. My cabin was isolated, perched on the edge of a ridge overlooking a small creek valley. It was a modest, single-room structure with a loft for sleeping and a small deck that wrapped around the front. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, dense with lodgepole pines and Douglas firs. The first week was rough. The cabin ran on solar power, but the system wasn't working properly, and most nights I was without lights after sunset. I tried to sleep under the loft, but the sounds of the forest, branches snapping, animals moving through the undergrowth, the wind rattling through the treetops, kept me awake. There were bats in the cabin that made soft, eerie fluttering noises at night, and I never felt entirely alone. The forest had a heavy, almost oppressive silence when the wind died down, as if it was holding its breath. By the third week, exhaustion was piling up. I had been awake for almost 30 days straight, moving between patrols, maintenance work, and emergency calls. My sense of time was distorted. I could no longer remember which nights were mine to sleep and which belonged to the forest. One night, after a long day inspecting trail damage from a recent storm, I decided to stay on the deck a while. The sky was clear, and the stars reflected off the creek below in a way that made the valley look like it was glowing. I leaned against the railing and tried to let the quiet calm me. That's when I first noticed it, a subtle crunching sound coming from the tree line. It was far enough away that it could have been a deer, but there was a deliberate rhythm to it, too methodical to be just an animal. I watched the dark shapes of the trees, trying to pick out movement. Nothing appeared and the sound stopped. I told myself it was probably just a bear or a raccoon. Bears were common in the area, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach told me it was something else. Something bigger and more intentional. A few nights later, I was patrolling the lower creek trails. Flashlight in hand, checking for illegal camping activity. The night was unusually still. The usual chorus of frogs and insects was muted, almost gone. I heard that same crunching sound again, this time closer. I froze. My flashlight beam swept across the dark shapes of the forest, and I saw it. Footprints. Large booted footprints, fresh, leading along the trail but vanishing into the woods on either side. They weren't mine. They weren't the hikers either, at least not anyone registered. I followed the trail cautiously, keeping my flashlight steady. Every few minutes the footprints would reappear, always ahead, always keeping pace with me as if someone was watching me from a distance. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to keep moving. I had a ranger's training, but training doesn't erase instinctual fear. After almost an hour, I realized the footprints were leading me in a circle, back toward my cabin. The next day I reported the footprints to the forest supervisor, who reminded me that poaching was a problem in the area and that I needed to remain vigilant. But no matter how rational I tried to be, a lingering sense of unease settled over me. I started carrying extra equipment on patrols: bear spray, a rifle, a first aid kit, and flares. I set motion sensors around the cabin, hoping to catch whatever or whoever had been following me. A week later, around midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the deck. Heavy, deliberate, slow. I was in the loft, awake, listening, heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed my rifle and crept down the ladder, trying to remain as silent as possible. The footsteps stopped as soon as I reached the floor. I shined my flashlight across the deck. Nothing. No shadows, no figure, nothing. Then I saw it. Scratches on the wood of the deck railing. Deep gouges, clearly made by a metal object, not claws. Someone had been there, close enough to touch me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I spent the next day boarding up the deck and checking all the locks. I didn't leave the cabin until daylight. The encounter didn't last much longer, thankfully. A week after the deck incident, a ranger from another district spotted a suspicious vehicle parked illegally near a trailhead. I drove down with him and discovered it belonged to a group of poachers targeting deer and elk. They had been in the area for weeks, watching the cabin, testing my routines. Their campsite had fire pits, traps, and hunting gear scattered around. When confronted by the authorities, they fled into the woods, abandoning everything. The forest felt safer after they were gone. After that summer, I left the Bitterroot district. I didn't get more sleep than before, but I left with a clear understanding of how real danger can hide quietly in the forest. There were no ghosts, no legends, just humans, wildlife, and the vast, indifferent wilderness. The experience stayed with me. A reminder that being alone in a place like that demands constant awareness. By the end of the season, I felt a quiet pride in having survived it, and the forest, in its eerie, silent way, finally seemed to let me breathe. I was 27 years old when I took the position as the lone recreation ranger at a small district in northern Montana. Back in 2017, the station was isolated, tucked into a ridge above the Bitterroot Valley, and the nearest town with a gas station and a grocery store was about 2 hours away by car. My duties were simple on paper: maintain trails, monitor visitor activity, check on campsites, and handle any emergencies that arose. But nothing in the handbook could have prepared me for what happened that summer. The station itself was a small wooden cabin perched on a bluff. Solar panels provided power, but the system had been acting up since I arrived. Some days the lights wouldn't turn on at all, leaving me to navigate with headlamps and flashlights. I hadn't slept properly for weeks. At first, it was just the usual ranger stress, irregular hours, constant vigilance, but soon the isolation and the odd noises outside began to gnaw at me. Bats had taken up residence in the loft, flitting around at night, and I'd occasionally hear something heavy pacing across the deck outside. One night, after a long day patrolling a trail that ran along a steep canyon, I returned to the station around 8 p.m. My legs were sore from scrambling over loose rock. My boots caked in mud, and I was starving. I started a fire in the small wood stove, trying to shake off the cold, damp air that had clung to me all day. I was so exhausted that I told myself I'd go to bed early, maybe finally get a full 6 hours of sleep. But the station had other plans. Just as I settled onto the cot in the loft with my sleeping bag, I heard it, a loud, deliberate thump on the back deck. I froze. The sound wasn't random. It was methodical, heavy, like someone, or something, was testing the wood with their weight. My first thought was that it was a deer, though deer don't usually climb onto decks. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the edge of the deck and the trees just beyond. Nothing moved. I tried to convince myself it was a branch falling, the wind, or a raccoon, but the air felt different that night. Tense. Tight. I made the mistake of opening the door to check. The cold air hit me and the smell of wet pine filled my nose. I scanned the ground with the flashlight. There were footprints, wide and heavy, in the soft mud right under the deck. They weren't human. Not completely. The toe marks were slightly longer than mine, the heels wider. My heart started hammering and I closed the door quickly, trying to rationalize. Maybe an elk had wandered close. Maybe the rain had shifted some fallen logs. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I dozed off, the memory of those prints crawled back into my mind. I checked every corner of the cabin multiple times, made sure all doors were locked, even reinforced them with whatever I could find. When morning came, I went out to inspect the area in daylight. The prints were gone, washed away by a sudden storm that had moved through overnight. I thought about telling my supervisor, but the area was known for mountain lions, bears, and large elk. Any of them could have been responsible. Days passed, and I continued my patrols, keeping my senses sharp. One afternoon, I was checking an abandoned trail that led up into a narrow canyon. The trail was overgrown, and the sun was low, casting long shadows across the rocks. I noticed a series of markings carved into the trees, not recent but still noticeable. Deep scratches at about eye level, irregular and wide. Bears scratched trees, but these marks were different, almost deliberate. The deeper I went into the canyon, the more I noticed signs of something big moving through. Crushed bushes, bent saplings, and occasional piles of scat that were unlike any animal I recognized. By evening, I had made my way to the top of the canyon, overlooking a wide valley. The sun was disappearing behind the ridges, and the canyon was quiet in that way that feels almost wrong, like it's holding its breath. I set up my tent on a small flat area and cooked my dinner. As I ate, I heard low guttural growls echoing from somewhere deep in the canyon. I froze, listening. They weren't consistent, and they didn't sound like any animal I knew. But the tracks and marks I had seen earlier told me they were large, and they were close. I spent the night sitting awake in my tent, flashlight in hand, every sound amplified. At dawn, I packed up quickly and made my way back down. On the return hike, I found something that made my stomach drop. A makeshift campsite, abandoned but recent. There was a tarp, a few rusted cans, and footprints that led up the canyon and disappeared into the trees. Whoever or whatever had been here had watched me, maybe even followed me. When I finally returned to the station, I reported everything to my supervisor. They took it seriously enough to send a team out to investigate. Over the next few weeks, it became clear what I had been dealing with. A large, solitary black bear, unusually aggressive, scavenging for food near human activity. The bear had been responsible for the footprints, the scratching, and the terrifying growls that kept me awake. Wildlife officials tracked it down, and it was safely relocated far from the area. After that summer, I slept again, finally. I took extra precautions with food storage, never walked alone at dusk in the canyon, and became much more aware of the signs of wildlife around me. The experience left me shaken, but it also made me a better ranger. I learned to respect the wilderness, to trust my instincts, and to recognize that fear doesn't always come from ghosts or monsters. It often comes from very real, very dangerous animals, and the choices we make in their territory. I was 28 years old when I took the seasonal ranger position at a small national forest in northern Arizona, just outside the small town of Williams. It was early June of 2019, and the forest was waking up fully after the mild winter. My station was a single small guard cabin perched on the edge of a ridge overlooking a deep canyon. The nearest town was nearly an hour and 45 minutes away by car, and cell service was spotty at best, mostly good for occasional texts near the top of the ridge. I liked the isolation at first. I thought I'd use it to clear my mind, hike, and focus on the seasonal work without distractions. The first few nights were rough. The cabin was old, solar-powered, and poorly maintained. The panels had been damaged the previous winter, so I had to rely on a single generator to power the fridge and lights. Most nights I couldn't sleep well. The structure groaned in the wind, and at first, I assumed the noises I heard were just the usual wildlife. Owls calling, the occasional coyote yipping in the distance. But there were other noises that didn't fit. I would wake up to the sound of soft, deliberate steps on the wooden deck, always in the same spot near the corner where the railing was weakest. Every time I checked, nothing was there. No tracks in the dirt or dust, no signs of animals. One evening I decided to take a hike around the northern trail of the ridge before sunset. The trail was steep and rocky, barely maintained, and I often worried about slipping. I had a habit of carrying a small pack with water, a first aid kit, and a flare gun just in case. The sky was clear, the sun lowering behind the distant peaks, casting long shadows through the pine trees. About 30 minutes into the hike, I noticed something odd. The fresh tire tracks of an ATV on the narrow dirt path. Vehicles weren't supposed to be up here, and the tracks were very recent. The forest was mostly empty except for me and the occasional hiker, and the tracks went deeper into the woods, towards a section marked as off-limits. I followed the tracks cautiously. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. Birds stopped calling. Insects seemed to pause mid-flight. I started feeling a tension in my chest, a kind of instinctive warning I couldn't shake. After another 10 minutes, I noticed something else. Scrapes on the trees along the trail. The bark was fresh, torn in vertical lines, as if something had clawed at them. Not like a bear or a mountain lion, though the size suggested a larger animal. My hands started sweating as I scanned the area. That night, back in the cabin, I double-checked the doors and windows. I kept my flashlight and flare gun next to the bed. Around 2 a.m., I heard the steps again, slow, deliberate, moving around the deck. This time I grabbed my flashlight and shined it outside. The beam caught movement just at the edge of the clearing. A figure, or something tall, was crouched just beyond the tree line. I couldn't see details. I froze. My stomach tightened, my legs refusing to move. It didn't run, didn't move toward the cabin. It just stayed there, watching. The next morning, I explored the perimeter around the cabin during daylight. I discovered footprints, oddly shaped, human-like but larger, like someone had unusually big boots, leading down into a drainage ravine behind the ridge. I didn't follow them fully. The slope was dangerous and the ground was loose, but there were enough signs to convince me someone had been living in the woods close to the cabin, watching me without my knowledge. Over the next week, the incidents escalated. Food supplies I left on the porch went missing. My generator would sometimes fail, though the fuel was full, leaving the cabin dark for hours at a time. I started sleeping in my clothes, flashlight in hand, eyes darting at every shadow. The strangest thing was that I never saw the person directly. I only caught glimpses, a silhouette here, a shadow there. I didn't hear voices or shouting, nothing human like I expected, but the presence was unmistakable. By the third week, my nerves were frayed. I began carrying a loaded rifle everywhere, hiking only during daylight and checking the perimeter repeatedly. One afternoon, I noticed movement near the edge of the trail. A man emerged from behind a tree, maybe mid-30s, wiry, dirty clothes, eyes wide and unblinking. I raised my rifle, heart pounding. He froze. Then slowly he lifted his hands, signaling surrender. I kept the gun raised, my finger on the trigger, my instinct screaming to keep him away. After a long minute, he spoke, or at least muttered something incoherent, and ran down the slope into the ravine. I followed cautiously, keeping distance, and found evidence of an abandoned campsite, a torn tent, empty food cans, and shallow dugouts where someone had been hiding. I reported the incident to the Forest Service the next day. They confirmed the man had been a local survivalist who had been living illegally in the forest, stealing supplies and hiding from authorities for months. He had no weapons on him when authorities found him, only camping gear. The ranger team escorted him out safely. I stayed another week, checking every trail, every nook, until I felt the woods had returned to normal. After the experience, I realized the forest wasn't haunted, and the noises weren't supernatural. It was isolation, human behavior, and the unknown that made it terrifying. The experience left me shaken, but also more aware of how careful a ranger must be. No heroic confrontation, no legends, just the careful observation of real danger and the patience to handle it responsibly. When I finally left that station and returned to town, I felt a strange sense of relief and accomplishment. The forest had tested me, but I had survived, and the danger had been contained without anyone getting seriously hurt. I was 28 years old when I took a seasonal job as the lone recreation ranger in a small district of the Bitterroot National Forest in western Montana. The station was a modest cabin tucked into a thick stand of lodgepole pine and fir, about an hour and a half from the nearest town. I'd grown up in suburban Washington and worked at a few national parks as a volunteer, but nothing prepared me for this kind of isolation. I moved in at the beginning of September, when the days were still warm, but the nights carried a sharp chill that crept under the doors and windows. The cabin ran on a small solar array and a backup generator, but the solar panels weren't functioning properly when I arrived. The generator was old and temperamental, and I couldn't risk relying on it continuously. I quickly learned to live with darkness. The first week passed quietly, but I noticed odd little things almost immediately. Footprints in the soft mud around the cabin that didn't match any of my boots, a series of scratches along the wooden deck, and the constant rustle of branches just beyond the tree line when there was no wind. I tried to brush it off. Predators, maybe a bear or a mountain lion. I carried bear spray and a rifle, and I had spent enough time in the backcountry to know to keep my wits about me. Sleeping became impossible. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and hear something pacing along the deck or the trail nearby. Sometimes I thought I could hear a low, guttural growl or something heavier moving through the underbrush. I would sit up with my flashlight, swinging it over the tree line, but there was nothing. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was the exhaustion and the stress, the isolation. Around the third week, my sleep deprivation reached a new level. I hadn't slept more than 3 or 4 hours at a time in days. One night I was walking along the narrow service trail that led to the ranger station's water source, a small creek fed by a mountain spring, when I noticed a set of tracks in the mud that hadn't been there earlier that day. They were large, human-like, but the stride was too long and uneven, as if whoever or whatever was moving through the forest had legs longer than mine, awkwardly powerful. I followed the tracks for a few hundred yards, keeping low and moving cautiously. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the only light came from my flashlight. The tracks led toward a clearing near a ridge, a place I knew well. Hunters sometimes used it in the fall, but the season hadn't started yet, so it should have been empty. The hairs on my neck stood on end. The track stopped abruptly at the edge of the clearing. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the ground. Disturbed leaves, broken branches, but no sign of anything alive. I waited, holding my breath, listening. A snapping twig, far off, maybe 100 yards away. Something was moving toward me. I ran. I don't remember thinking. My legs pumped as if they had a mind of their own. I didn't stop until I burst through the tree line and into the cabin clearing. My chest heaving, hands shaking, I bolted the door and jammed the bolt. I checked the cabin for a while. Every window, every corner. Nothing. The forest was silent. For the next week, I kept a detailed log of everything I saw, heard, and tracked. The footprints appeared almost every night, always circling the cabin, sometimes vanishing just out of sight. Occasionally, I saw broken brush moving in the distance, but the solar lanterns on the porch didn't reveal anyone. My nerves frayed. I started carrying my rifle with me everywhere, even for minor tasks. Then one afternoon, I noticed something unmistakable. A pile of supplies was gone from the back porch, packets of dried food, a case of bottled water. Not much, but enough to confirm that someone had been entering the cabin while I was inside. Whoever it was, they had been patient, careful, waiting until I wasn't looking. The forest no longer felt like wilderness. It felt like a trap. I didn't call for backup immediately. I wanted to be certain, to be strategic. I spent the next 2 nights observing from the cabin, staying quiet, listening. Around midnight on the second night, I finally caught movement. A tall, lean figure moving slowly along the deck, careful not to make noise. I raised my flashlight, swept it across the clearing. It froze, then bolted into the tree line. I fired a warning shot, more instinct than anything else. The figure disappeared into the darkness. The following morning, I found a discarded backpack partially hidden under a brush pile near the creek. It contained camping supplies, a small amount of food, and a map of the park with several areas circled. Whoever had been following me wasn't random. They knew the terrain, the patrol routes, and they had planned their approach carefully. I reported everything to the Forest Service. They sent a small response team, and over the next few days they tracked the intruders' movements. Eventually, they found a campsite deep in the forest where someone had been living, observing the ranger station for weeks. No one was arrested, just a transient who had been evading authorities, but the pattern stopped after the team moved through the area. By the time I left the station at the end of the season, the forest felt normal again. The strange tracks disappeared, the unsettling sounds vanished, and I could sleep without fear of someone lurking just outside the cabin. The experience left me exhausted, wary, and far more respectful of how vulnerable a lone ranger can be in such isolation. I never encountered the person again, but I carry that season with me. The fear wasn't supernatural. It was real, human, and meticulous. It was a reminder that the forest, even in its most peaceful moments, can hide threats that aren't imagined, and that solitude can sharpen senses but also leave you exposed in ways you never expect.